Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, or maybe even drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. It was a Thursday night, and I had just finished my rounds on the third floor of the hospital. The shift had been quiet, nothing out of the ordinary, until I reached room 312. It was a private room, reserved for an older man named Mr. Callahan, who had been admitted for observation. When I entered the room, something felt off immediately. The bed was empty. The only thing left was his hospital gown, neatly folded on the chair by the window. I checked the chart by the bed. No discharge orders, no notes, nothing that explained why the patient was missing. I pressed the call button, summoning one of the other nurses. "Where's Mr. Callahan?" I asked when she arrived. She looked at me, confused. "He should be here. I was just in his room a couple of hours ago. We checked the bathroom, the hallways, every place a patient might wander off to, but he was gone. Completely." I reported the disappearance to the head nurse, expecting an immediate search, but she brushed it off. "Patients wander sometimes," she said. "He'll turn up." That didn't sit right with me. Mr. Callahan wasn't the wandering type. He was quiet, weak, and bedridden. Where could he have gone, and why would he leave his clothes behind? I couldn't shake the unease that settled deep in my chest. Something wasn't right, and I needed to figure out what. By the end of my shift, I still hadn't seen any sign of Mr. Callahan. The official word from the hospital was that he must have left on his own accord, though no one could explain how. There were no security alerts, no footage of him exiting the building. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions. Why would a frail, elderly man just vanish? How could no one else be concerned? The lack of answers gnawed at me. The next day, I came in early for my shift, hoping there had been some development. But when I checked the system, Mr. Callahan's file had already been closed. The entry simply read, "Patient discharged, left of own will." That was it. No explanation, no details. I couldn't believe it. People don't just disappear from a hospital, leaving nothing but their clothes. I approached the head nurse again, but she gave me the same dismissive response as before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mr. Callahan and the unsettling emptiness of his room. Hospitals are supposed to be places of safety and order, but something about this didn't feel safe at all. The next day, I decided to do something about it. I logged into the hospital system and pulled up his medical records. Everything seemed routine, but there was one odd detail. His admission papers were signed by someone I didn't recognize. The signature on the papers wasn't from any of the doctors who usually worked in our department. It looked sloppy, almost hurried. The doctor's name was unfamiliar, and when I asked around, no one had ever heard of him. I started digging deeper, looking through old patient files, trying to find any other unusual patterns. That's when I discovered something even stranger. Over the past few months, several patients had been discharged under similar circumstances. Each of the patients had vanished without a trace. All of them elderly, all of them with no family to follow up. Their files were closed within hours of their disappearance, and the same mysterious doctor had signed off on their discharge papers. I felt a chill run down my spine as the pieces started to come together. This wasn't just a mistake or oversight. Something deliberate was happening here, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I brought my findings to the hospital administration, expecting them to take action. Instead, they were furious with me for accessing the records without permission. I was told to drop the issue and focus on my duties, but how could I? Patients were disappearing under strange circumstances, and no one seemed to care. I realized then that if I wanted answers, I'd have to find them on my own. I wasn't going to let this go. The next night, I stayed late after my shift ended. I hung around near the nurse's station, pretending to work on charts while keeping an eye on the security monitors. If someone was sneaking patients out of the hospital, I wanted to see how they were doing it. Hours passed with nothing unusual happening, but just as I was about to give up, I saw movement on the screen. A man in a white coat, pushing a wheelchair. I leaned in closer, my heart racing. The man wasn't one of our regular doctors, and there was no patient in the wheelchair, just a folded hospital gown. He moved quickly, heading toward the service elevator, avoiding the main halls. I grabbed my things and followed, keeping my distance. I watched as he wheeled the empty chair into the elevator and pressed the button for the basement. My pulse quickened. I had never been down there. I hesitated for a moment, but I knew this was my chance. I waited until the elevator returned and stepped inside, pressing the button for the basement. The ride down felt longer than it should have, the air growing colder the further I descended. When the doors opened, I was met with a dimly lit hallway that I didn't recognize. It was eerily quiet, and the scent of antiseptic was overwhelming. I stepped out cautiously, searching for any sign of the man. The basement wasn't part of the hospital I had ever needed to visit before. It was mostly used for storage, or so I thought. As I moved further down the hallway, I could hear faint voices up ahead. I crept closer, stopping just before a door marked restricted access. Through the small window, I could see two men in lab coats standing by a metal table. On the table were more neatly folded hospital gowns and several sets of clothes. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but one of them handed the other a clipboard, pointing to something on the paper. I had seen enough. I backed away from the door, my mind spinning. This was no mistake. They were hiding something down here, and whatever it was, it involved the missing patients. I rushed back to the elevator, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to figure out who those men were. The next day, I called in sick to work, determined to uncover the truth. I spent hours searching online for any information about the hospital's basement and the mysterious doctor who had signed Mr. Callahan's discharge papers. But there was nothing. It was as if he didn't exist. Frustrated, I decided to return to the hospital that night, armed with a small camera. If I could get evidence of what was happening, maybe someone would finally listen. I arrived just before midnight, slipping in through a side entrance. The hospital was quiet, most of the staff gone for the night. I made my way back to the basement, carefully avoiding the security cameras I had memorized from the monitors. When I reached the restricted access door, I paused, my heart pounding. I had no idea what I would find behind that door, but I had to know. Slowly, I pushed it open, camera ready. The room was empty this time, but the folded clothes were still there, along with several files scattered across the metal table. I hurried over and started snapping pictures, my hands shaking. The files were patient records, each one for an elderly person who had disappeared from the hospital. The same doctor's name appeared on every one. My breath caught in my throat as I realized just how many people had been taken. This wasn't just a few patients. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching. I panicked, grabbing one of the files and stuffing it into my bag before darting out the door. I made it to the elevator just in time, my heart racing as the doors slid shut. Whoever had been coming down that hallway didn't see me. I made it back to the third floor and into the break room, barely able to catch my breath. My hands were shaking as I opened my bag and pulled out the file I had grabbed. The name on it wasn't Mr. Callahan's, but it was familiar. Another elderly patient who had disappeared a few weeks ago. Their file was marked with the same odd details as Mr. Callahan's. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. This patient had no family, no visitors, and they had been discharged under the same strange circumstances. But the file had something else, something different. There was a note attached, written by the same mysterious doctor. It simply read, "Suitable for transfer." Transfer where? I didn't know. but I was starting to get an idea of what was happening here, and it wasn't good. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just a few patients going missing. There was something systematic about it. Patients with no family or friends, no one to notice if they disappeared, and the way their files were being closed so quickly. It was as if they were being erased, not just from the hospital, but from existence. I had to find out more. I needed to know where these patients were being transferred. I decided to follow the doctor. If I could find him, maybe I could find out what was really happening. The next few days, I watched for him, always keeping my distance. I didn't want to raise any suspicions. It wasn't easy. He seemed to only appear late at night, and when he did, he moved quickly, always heading toward the basement. I began to suspect that whatever was happening down there was part of something larger. One night, I got lucky. I saw the doctor leaving the hospital, slipping out a side door near the service entrance. I followed him, staying in the shadows, my heart pounding with every step. He walked for several blocks before stopping at an old, run-down building that looked abandoned. I watched as he unlocked the door and disappeared inside. This was it. This had to be where the patients were being taken, but I needed proof. I waited outside the building for hours, hoping to see something that would confirm my suspicions. But nothing happened. No one entered or left, and the windows were dark. I was about to give up when I heard a faint noise, like the creak of a door opening. I pressed myself against the wall, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the building. I crept around the side, trying to stay as quiet as possible. When I reached the back of the building, I saw a small door propped open. Light spilled out from inside, casting long shadows on the ground. My pulse quickened as I moved closer, careful not to make a sound. I peered inside and saw a narrow hallway leading to a stairwell. There were voices coming from below. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was serious. I knew I was close to finding the truth. I waited for the voices to fade before slipping inside. The hallway was cold, and the air smelled faintly of chemicals. As I approached the stairwell, I could hear more voices, this time louder. They were coming from deep below, down several flights of stairs. My heart raced as I descended, each step echoing in the silence. I kept to the shadows, terrified of being caught, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what was happening. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in another hallway, this one lined with metal doors. Each door had a small, rectangular window at the top, and through one of them, I could see a dimly lit room. There were figures moving inside, people in lab coats, standing around a patient strapped to a gurney. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. Whatever this was, it wasn't medical care. It was something much darker. I crept closer to the door, trying to get a better look. The patient on the gurney wasn't moving. I couldn't tell if they were unconscious, or worse, the doctors, if that's what they were talking in low voices, discussing something I couldn't quite make out. I reached for my camera, but just as I raised it to take a picture, one of the doctors glanced toward the window. I ducked out of sight, my heart pounding. I waited, holding my breath, praying they hadn't seen me. After a few tense moments, the voices resumed, and I risked another glance. The doctors were focused on their work again, and the patient still wasn't moving. I took a quick photo through the window, capturing the scene. My hands were shaking as I stepped back from the door. I needed to get out of there before they noticed me. But just as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps. Someone was coming down the hallway. I ducked into a nearby storage closet, barely managing to close the door before the footsteps reached me. Through a crack in the door, I saw one of the doctors walk by, clipboard in hand. He paused outside the room with the gurney, peering in through the window, before nodding and walking away. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, before slipping out of the closet and making my escape. My heart was racing as I fled back up the stairs and out of the building. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, my lungs burning from the effort. Once I felt safe, I ducked into an alley and pulled out my camera. The photos were blurry, but they were enough. I had proof that something terrible was happening. But what could I do with it? Who would believe me? I knew I couldn't go to the hospital administration. The next morning, I called in sick again, still shaken from what I had seen. I spent hours staring at the photos on my camera, trying to figure out my next move. Going to the police was risky. I had broken into that building. If I wasn't careful, I could get in serious trouble, but I couldn't just do nothing. Those patients were being held against their will, and I was the only one who knew where they were. I decided to reach out to a friend of mine who worked in investigative journalism. She had connections, and if anyone could help me get the word out, it was her. I sent her the photos, along with everything I had learned about the missing patients. Within an hour, she called me, her voice tense. "This is huge," she said. "You need to be careful. Whoever's behind this isn't going to let you expose them without a fight." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I knew she was right. I was dealing with something dangerous, something much bigger than just a few missing patients. But I couldn't back down now. With her help, I started gathering more information, looking for any connections between the hospital and the building I had followed the doctor to. It didn't take long to find one. The building was owned by a private medical research firm. The firm specialized in experimental treatments, the kind that were still in the early stages of development. I found news articles about them, but most were vague, full of technical jargon that made it hard to understand what they were really doing. But one thing was clear: they were operating in a legal gray area, pushing the boundaries of what was allowed in the name of progress. I couldn't help but wonder if that's what the patients were being used for. The more I dug, the worse it got. I found lawsuits that had been quietly settled, reports of patients who had suffered severe side effects from the treatments being developed. But these weren't just patients. They were test subjects, people with no family, no advocates, and no one to question what had happened to them. My stomach turned as I realized that Mr. Callahan and the others were part of this same twisted experiment. My stomach turned as I realized that Mr. Callahan and the others were part of this same twisted experiment. I couldn't believe that something like this was happening in my hospital, right under our noses. I knew I had to get more concrete evidence, something that would expose the firm and shut them down for good. My journalist friend agreed to help me, but she warned me to be careful. If these people were willing to use human lives like this, they wouldn't hesitate to silence me. The next few days, I laid low, avoiding work and trying to gather more information. I went back to the hospital to snoop around, pretending to be there for a shift. I overheard a conversation between two doctors, and one of them mentioned Mr. Callahan. My heart raced as I listened. "He was transferred yesterday," one of them said casually. The other doctor just nodded. "Transferred where?" I had to find out where these transfers were happening. That night, I decided to go back to the building where I had seen the doctor take the patients. I needed to get inside again, this time without being seen. I waited until late, then snuck around the back, using the same door I had entered before. The hallway was quiet, and I slipped down the stairs, my camera ready. The voices were there again, coming from the same room. I carefully crept forward, heart pounding as I prepared to capture more evidence. When I reached the door, I risked another glance through the small window. The same doctors were there, but this time, the room was empty. No patients, no gurneys. They were discussing something in low voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I snapped a few photos, hoping they would be enough to confirm their identities. Just as I was about to leave, one of the doctors opened a cabinet, and I saw several vials of a strange, glowing liquid. The sight of those vials made my blood run cold. Whatever they were using those for, it wasn't good. I snapped more photos, and quickly retreated up the stairs, trying not to make a sound. Once outside, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had more evidence now, but I still didn't have enough to take them down. I needed to find the patients. where they were being taken, and what was happening to them. The next step was going to be dangerous, but I had no choice. The following day, I received an anonymous tip. A note had been slipped under my apartment door, written in shaky handwriting. It said, "You're being watched. They know." My heart skipped a beat. Someone knew what I was doing. I looked around, paranoid that someone was watching me even now. How had they found out? I needed to act fast. I gathered everything I had: photos, notes, the patient file I had taken, and headed to my friend's office. We spent hours poring over the evidence, trying to piece everything together. The firm, the missing patients, the strange experiments. It all pointed to something bigger than we had originally thought. My friend was able to find more information on the research firm. They were receiving private funding from several shadowy organizations, none of which had any public records. Whoever was behind this was powerful, and they didn't want to be exposed. That night, I followed the doctor again. He left the hospital as usual, heading toward the building. This time, instead of waiting outside, I followed him in. I knew it was risky, but I needed to see what happened inside. The moment he entered the building, I slipped in after him, staying close enough to hear his footsteps, but far enough back that he wouldn't notice me. The hallways were darker than before, and the air felt heavier, as if the building itself was alive with secrets. I watched as the doctor entered another room on the lower floor. I waited for a few minutes before approaching, then peered through the small window in the door. Inside, the doctor was talking to a man in a suit, someone I hadn't seen before. They were looking over a file, and from the glimpse I caught, it had the same markings as the other patient files I had seen. My heart raced as I realized they were planning something new, something involving more patients. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I couldn't leave without more proof. I pulled out my phone and started recording through the window, capturing the conversation as best I could. The man in the suit was discussing additional subjects and accelerated trials. Every word made my stomach turn. They were planning to ramp up their experiments, and more people were going to disappear. I had to stop them, but how? Who could I trust with this information? Before I could think of my next move, the door creaked open slightly. I panicked, pressing myself against the wall, trying to stay hidden. The man in the suit stepped out, his face calm and composed, as if he didn't have a care in the world. He walked past me without noticing, and I let out a sigh of relief. The doctor followed soon after, leaving the room empty. Now was my chance. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and quickly scanned the desk for anything useful. On the desk, I found more files, but these were different. They weren't just patient files. They were reports, detailing the results of their trials. I skimmed through one of them, horrified by what I was reading. These weren't medical experiments. They were something far more sinister. The reports described how patients had been subjected to various treatments, each more dangerous than the last. Many of them hadn't survived. My hands trembled as I snapped photos of the documents. I knew I had enough now. There was no turning back. I left the building as quickly as I could, my heart still racing. The photos, the recordings, the patient files. It was all coming together. But I was scared. If they found out what I had, they wouldn't hesitate to come after me. I had to move fast, get the evidence to my friend, before they could cover their tracks. I made my way back to her office, constantly checking over my shoulder, expecting someone to follow me. When I arrived at her office, she was already waiting for me. I showed her everything, and we immediately started working on the story. It was going to be huge, and we both knew it. But we also knew the risks. Whoever was behind these experiments had a lot of power, and they wouldn't take kindly to being exposed. Still, we had no choice. The world needed to know what was happening. We just had to be smart, careful. Over the next few days, we prepared the story, double-checking every fact, every piece of evidence. The plan was to release it all at once: photos, videos, and a full article. But as the deadline approached, I started to feel uneasy. I had received more anonymous messages, warning me to stop. "You don't know who you're dealing with," one of them said. "Back off, before it's too late." But I couldn't back off now, not after everything I had seen. The night before the story was set to go live, I stayed at my friend's apartment, too nervous to go home. We worked late into the night, finalizing everything. But around midnight, there was a knock at the door. My friend and I exchanged a nervous glance. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help if needed, and she cautiously opened the door. Standing there was a man in a dark suit, holding an envelope. He handed it to her without a word, then left. We opened the envelope together, our hands shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just 2 words: "Stop, now." My heart sank. They knew what we were about to do. They were watching us. My friend looked at me, her face pale. "What do we do?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "We go through with it," I said. "We have no choice," I said firmly. "If we stop now, they win. And who knows how many more patients will disappear." My friend nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We spent the rest of the night finalizing the article and uploading all the photos and videos. By the time dawn broke, we were ready. The story was set to go live within the hour. We were both exhausted, but I felt a sense of determination like never before. As we waited for the story to go public, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Every sound outside made me jump. Every passing car felt like it was slowing down just a little too much. But we stayed vigilant, determined to see it through. When the story finally went live, it was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. It was out there now, beyond our control. The truth was no longer hidden. The response was immediate. Within minutes, the article started gaining traction online. People were sharing it, commenting, demanding answers from the hospital and the research firm. My phone started ringing non-stop. Calls from journalists, investigators, and even some officials. But I ignored them all. I needed to lay low, to be careful. The truth was out, but that didn't mean we were safe. If anything, we had just become even bigger targets. By the end of the day, the hospital had released a vague statement denying any wrongdoing. They claimed the patients had left of their own accord, and that the research firm had no affiliation with them, but the damage was done. Investigators were already swarming the hospital, demanding access to records. My friend and I watched from the safety of her apartment. As the news broke on every major outlet, we had done it. We had exposed the truth. For a few days, everything seemed to be under control. The authorities had begun investigating the research firm, and the hospital was under intense scrutiny, but I couldn't relax. I kept expecting something to go wrong, for someone to show up at my door. My friend felt the same way. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, unsure of who might be watching. The threats had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like the calm before the storm. A week after the article went live, I woke up to find an unmarked envelope under my door. My stomach dropped as I picked it up, already knowing it wasn't good. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of me, taken from a distance, as I walked home from my friend's apartment the night before. My blood ran cold. They knew where I was. They had been watching me this whole time, waiting for the right moment to strike. I called my friend immediately, but she didn't answer. Panic set in as I tried calling again and again, with no response. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, heading straight to her apartment. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I pushed it open, stepping inside cautiously. The place was a mess, as if someone had left in a hurry. But she was gone. There was no sign of her, just another envelope on the kitchen table. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a note, written in the same handwriting as the previous threats. "She's with us now. Back off, or you're next." My mind raced. What had they done to her? Where had they taken her? I wanted to run to the police, but I knew that whoever these people were, they had power, connections. I couldn't trust anyone. I was completely alone, and my friend was in danger because of me. I spent the next few hours pacing my apartment, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't just sit here waiting for them to come for me next. I had to act. I grabbed the rest of the evidence I had collected and packed it into a small bag. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the press. If I could expose them even further, make it impossible for them to hide, maybe I could save my friend. I met with a trusted journalist from a major network, handing over everything I had. "You need to get this out there," I told him. "It's the only way to stop them." He nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Within hours, the story was running on every news outlet. More details about the research firm, more connections to other missing patients. It was a full-blown scandal now, and there was no way they could cover it up. The next day I received a call. It was my friend. Her voice was shaky, but she was alive. "They let me go," she whispered. "I don't know why, but I think it's because of the story. They can't hide anymore." Relief washed over me, but I could still hear the fear in her voice. We both knew that just because they had released her didn't mean we were safe. We had stirred up a hornet's nest, and we had to be careful. Over the next few weeks, the investigation deepened. The research firm was shut down, and several arrests were made. The full scope of what they had been doing came to light: illegal human experimentation, cover-ups, and countless patients who had been taken without consent. It was horrifying, but at least the world knew the truth now. My friend and I tried to move on, but the experience had changed us. We would never forget what had happened. Even though the firm was shut down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. There were too many loose ends, too many people involved who had escaped justice. I had exposed one piece of the puzzle, but I knew there was more. I tried to return to my normal life, to work my shifts at the hospital, but everything felt different now. The hospital itself felt different. I couldn't walk through those halls without wondering what else was being hidden. One evening, I received another message, this time on my phone. "You did well," it read, "but you only scratched the surface." My heart sank as I stared at the screen. Who had sent it? Was it a warning, or was it someone who had been trying to help me all along? I would never know for sure, but one thing was clear: the deeper truth had yet to be uncovered, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to keep digging. Despite everything, I couldn't stop thinking about what the message meant. What else was out there, hidden beneath the surface? I knew I could walk away now, live my life, and try to forget about it. But that wasn't who I was. I couldn't live with myself if I let the rest of the truth stay buried. So I made a decision. I would keep looking, keep searching, until I uncovered every last piece of the puzzle. As I prepared to continue my investigation, I realized something. This had never been just about the patients, or even the research firm. It was about something bigger, something systemic. There were people in power who had allowed this to happen, people who were profiting from it, and I wasn't sure how deep it went. But I knew one thing for certain. I had to keep fighting, no matter how dangerous it became. The truth was too important to abandon. With my bag packed, and my mind made up, I set out to uncover the rest of the story. I didn't know where the investigation would take me, or who I would meet along the way, but I was ready. The world deserved to know what had happened, and I wasn't going to stop until I had exposed everything. I had come too far to back down now. This was only the beginning, and I was prepared for whatever came next. As I walked away from the hospital for what felt like the 100th time, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The building loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of the secrets it still held. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had survived the worst, and I knew I could survive whatever came next. Next story. I was at the cafe on 5th Avenue, where I usually grab my morning coffee. The barista gave me a weird look, like she had seen me before that day. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said, "Weren't you here earlier? Same order, same table?" I laughed it off, but a chill ran down my spine. I hadn't been to the cafe that morning. In fact, I had just arrived from home. It didn't stop there. Later that day, my coworker James approached me in the hallway at work, confused. "Why'd you leave without saying anything earlier?" he asked. I stared at him, puzzled. "What do you mean? I hadn't left the office since I arrived." He seemed frustrated and walked away, but his words lingered with me. Who could possibly look so much like me that it fooled everyone I knew? The next morning, I decided to retrace my steps. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. As I walked toward the cafe again, I noticed someone moving in my peripheral vision. I turned, and my heart nearly stopped. Across the street, walking in the opposite direction, was a man who looked exactly like me. Same jacket, same stride, same everything. He glanced back, eyes locking with mine for just a second. I froze, unsure whether to follow him or run the other way. Before I could decide, he disappeared into the crowd. My pulse was racing. There was no way I imagined that. I wasn't seeing things, was I? As I crossed the street to where he had been, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my sister. "Are you messing with me? You said you'd be at Mom's an hour ago, but you're not answering the door." I called her immediately. "I'm nowhere near Mom's. I haven't left downtown," I said. She sounded annoyed, then worried. "But I saw you through the window. You were wearing that green jacket you love." I hung up, feeling dizzy. I wore that jacket today. It was unmistakable. I didn't know what to do. This wasn't just mistaken identity. Someone was impersonating me, down to the smallest detail. That night, I locked my doors and checked them twice. The feeling that someone else was living my life was overwhelming. I couldn't shake it. What if this person knew everything about me? The thought of him moving through the city, fooling my friends and family, made my skin crawl. I tried to sleep, but every sound outside made me sit up in bed. I couldn't rest with the idea that my double might be nearby. I spent the next day on edge, avoiding places where I might run into him. I called in sick to work, stayed away from my usual spots. Every time my phone buzzed with a text, my heart raced. At around noon, I got a message from James. "Dude, are you okay? You left without a word again." I hadn't left my apartment all day. He must have seen him, the person who looked like me. But how? I decided to confront this head-on. I called my boss and asked for security footage from the office parking lot. He was hesitant but finally agreed after I explained my situation. When I watched the footage, my stomach churned. There I was, or rather, he was, walking out of the building, looking exactly like me. The resemblance was terrifying, but what really scared me was how calm he looked, as if he belonged there. I tried to find any difference, something that would set him apart from me, but there was nothing. He even drove a car that looked exactly like mine. But here's the thing. My car had been parked outside my apartment all day. How could he have the same one? I called the police, but they brushed me off, thinking I was overreacting. "People look alike sometimes," they said, but this was more than a coincidence. Determined to get answers, I spent the next few days searching for him. I knew he had to be nearby. Each time I went outside, I scanned every face, watching for a glimpse of my double. But he was always one step ahead. My friends started to avoid me, complaining that I was acting erratic. Even my family seemed distant, as if they couldn't quite trust me anymore. Maybe they weren't sure who I was. One night, I woke up to a loud knock at my door. My heart jumped in my chest as I crept to the peephole. No one was there. But something caught my eye. On the floor outside, there was a note. I opened the door cautiously, picked it up, and unfolded it. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "You know who I am." Stop looking. My blood turned cold. He knew I was searching for him. I didn't sleep that night. My mind raced with possibilities. How could he be so confident? He had to be watching me, maybe even following me. The idea that he was always nearby made my skin crawl. What did he want from me? I knew I had to figure this out before it was too late. The next morning, I packed a bag, ready to leave the city if things got worse. But before I could, something happened. I was walking back from the grocery store when I saw him again. This time, he didn't disappear. He was standing across the street, staring right at me. My heart pounded in my ears as I froze. He didn't move, just kept watching me with an unsettling calm. I forced myself to cross the street, determined to confront him. But as I got closer, he turned and walked away, melting into the crowd before I could catch up. That was the last straw. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder. I drove out to the police station and demanded to file a report. They took me a bit more seriously this time, but still, there wasn't much they could do. No one had technically committed a crime. The officers said they'd keep an eye out, but I knew it wouldn't help. This was my fight now. I was on my own. Days went by without any sign of him. I began to hope maybe he'd given up, moved on to someone else. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Then, one evening, as I was leaving my apartment, I noticed something strange on my car's windshield. It was another note, but this time it wasn't written. It was a photo. A photo of me, taken from a distance, walking alone. I hadn't seen anyone nearby that day. The photo sent a wave of terror through me. He wasn't just watching me, he was stalking me. Every move I made, he knew. And if he had the ability to track me so closely, it meant he wasn't going to stop until... What? He took over my life? Replaced me completely. I couldn't live like this. That night, I packed up my car and drove to a motel a few towns over. I needed time to think. At the motel, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump, and I kept checking my phone, expecting another message. But it never came. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of safety. The distance, the anonymity, it helped. I stayed there for 3 days, trying to figure out my next move. But on the 4th day, something happened that shattered that brief peace I had found. I went to the front desk to extend my stay, and the receptionist smiled at me. "Oh, you're leaving today, right?" she asked. Confused, I shook my head. "No, I'm staying another night." Her smile faded. "But you checked out this morning." My blood ran cold. I hadn't left my room all morning. The receptionist looked at me with concern, but I didn't stick around to explain. I grabbed my things and ran to my car. The drive back to the city was a blur. All I knew was that no matter how far I ran, he was going to find me. There was no escaping him. I had to confront this head-on. I parked outside my apartment and stared up at the window, half expecting to see him there. But everything was quiet. Still. Too still. I stepped out of the car, ready to face whatever was waiting for me inside. As I reached for my keys, I heard footsteps behind me. Slowly, I turned. There he was, standing just a few feet away, looking exactly like me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, he smiled. A cold, calculated smile that chilled me to the bone. "I don't want your life," he said quietly. "I just want you to know that I can take it whenever I want." Then he turned and walked away. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and stumbled into my apartment. My mind raced. What did he mean by that? I didn't want to live in fear, but his words were burned into my thoughts. He didn't need to replace me. He had already won. Everywhere I went, he could show up. Any moment, he could invade my life again. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. Over the next few days, I tried to act normal, as if nothing had happened. I went to work, smiled at my neighbors, and went about my daily routine. But I was always looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear. He didn't. It was like he had vanished. But that didn't bring me any relief. If anything, it made things worse. The waiting, the not knowing. It was a new kind of terror. A week passed without any sign of him. It was almost enough to make me believe that maybe it was over. Maybe I'd won. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, as I was getting ready to head home from work, I got a text from my mother. "You didn't have to be so rude earlier," it said. My heart sank. I hadn't spoken to her in days. What had he done this time? I called her immediately. "Mom, what do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky. She sighed. "You stopped by the house this morning and barely said a word. You seemed off." I felt my chest tighten. "That wasn't me, Mom," I said quietly. She paused, clearly confused. "What are you talking about?" I didn't have the energy to explain, so I hung up. He was still out there, playing his game, slipping into my life whenever he wanted. The next day, I decided to visit my mom in person. I needed to see if I could find any clues, any signs that he had been there. When I arrived, she greeted me with a cautious smile. "You seemed different yesterday," she said, "more distant." I nodded, not really knowing what to say. As I stepped inside, I glanced around the house, looking for anything out of place. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. There was a cup on the kitchen table. It was my favorite mug from when I was a kid, something I hadn't seen in years. My mom noticed me staring at it. "You brought it with you yesterday," she said. "I didn't even know you still had it." I didn't. I hadn't touched that mug in over a decade, but he had. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. He was deeper into my life than I thought. I left my mom's house in a daze, my mind spiraling. If he could access things from my past, things I hadn't even thought about in years, what else did he know? What else was he capable of? The idea that he could reach so far into my personal history terrified me. As I drove back to my apartment, I realized something. He wasn't just trying to mess with me. He was erasing me, piece by piece. I couldn't let him win. I had to fight back. But how do you fight someone who knows everything about you? Someone who can become you whenever they choose? I started keeping track of everything I did, writing down my daily activities in a notebook. I figured if I had a record of my life, it would be harder for him to slip in unnoticed. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I had some control. I also began changing my routines. I stopped going to the cafe, took different routes to work, and avoided places where he might show up. It helped, at least for a while. The more unpredictable I became, the harder it was for him to mimic me. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The paranoia was eating me alive. Then, one night, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed it open. Everything seemed untouched, but there was something off. On the table, next to my notebook, was a pen I didn't recognize. It was an old, cheap pen, the kind I hadn't used in years. He had been here. He was showing me that no matter what I did, he could always find a way in. I searched the apartment, but there was no sign of him. Just the pen, mocking me from the table. It felt like he was taunting me, reminding me that he was always a step ahead. I wanted to scream, to break something, but instead, I sat down and stared at the pen for what felt like hours. What was his endgame? Why was he doing this? I needed answers, but I had no idea how to get them. The next morning, I decided to confront him again. I didn't care about the risks anymore. I needed to end this. I went back to the spot where I had seen him last, near the cafe downtown. I spent hours walking around the area, scanning every face in the crowd. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw him. He was sitting at an outdoor table, calmly sipping a coffee. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. I walked over, my hands clenched into fists. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He just shrugged and gestured for me to sit down. Reluctantly, I did. "What do you want from me?" I asked again. He took a sip of his coffee and looked me in the eye. "I don't want anything from you," he said softly. "I just want to see how far I can go before you break." His words hit me like a sledgehammer. He didn't want my life. He didn't want to replace me. He just wanted to see me unravel. This wasn't about taking anything from me. It was about destroying me from the inside out. I stood up, my legs shaking. "You're sick," I muttered. He smiled again, a cold, emotionless smile that made my skin crawl. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm also very good at what I do." I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. As I made my way down the street, I felt like I was suffocating. His words echoed in my mind. "I just want to see how far I can go." He wasn't going to stop. He was going to keep pushing, keep testing me, until I finally broke. But I wasn't going to let him win. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected it to be him. I started avoiding people, isolating myself from my friends and family. The less they saw of me, the less he could mess with them. But that only made things worse. I was playing right into his hands, and I knew it. Then, one night, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside my apartment door. My heart raced as I listened, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, the door handle turned. I jumped out of bed, grabbing the closest thing I could find, a lamp, and rushed to the door. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. I stood there, panting, the lamp shaking in my hands. Had it been him? Was he just messing with me again? I stepped into the hallway, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. But there was no one there. Just silence. My apartment building was usually quiet at night, but this silence felt different. It felt heavier, like the air itself was thick with tension. I walked back inside and locked the door, checking it twice before returning to bed. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every small noise, every creak, made me sit up in fear. But nothing happened. He didn't come back. Still, I knew that he was always near. In the morning, I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. I needed to take control of the situation. That's when I decided to leave the city. Not forever, but just long enough to clear my head, to put some distance between me and him. Maybe, if I left, he would lose interest. I packed a small bag and made my way to the train station, determined to disappear for a while. As I boarded the train, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Leaving the city felt like the right move, but a part of me feared that he would follow. Still, as the train rumbled away from the station, I allowed myself to breathe again. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over my life. Maybe, just maybe, I could outrun him. Maybe he wouldn't follow this time. The town I arrived in was quiet, far from the noise and chaos of the city. I rented a small cabin on the edge of the woods, hoping the isolation would give me the peace I needed. For the first few days, it worked. I spent my time walking through the forest, clearing my head, trying to forget everything that had happened. It felt good to be disconnected from my old life, even if it was only temporary. But, as always, the peace didn't last. On the third night, I was sitting outside, staring up at the stars, when I heard it. The faint crunch of footsteps in the woods behind the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was trying not to be heard. I stood up, and backed toward the cabin door, my pulse racing. Had he found me already? I quickly locked the door behind me, peeking through the window into the darkness. There was nothing there, no movement, no sign of anyone, but I knew I hadn't imagined those footsteps. They had been real, and I was certain it was him. He had followed me, just like I feared. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, listening, waiting for the next sound, the next hint that he was near. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't run from him anymore. No matter where I went, he would follow. The only way to stop this was to face him. I wasn't going to let him win, not after everything he had put me through. So I packed up my things and headed back to the city. The closer I got, the more determined I felt. This time, I would find him. This time, I wouldn't back down. When I arrived back in the city, I went straight to my apartment. Everything was just as I had left it, which was a small comfort. I sat down and made a plan. I needed to lure him out, force him to reveal himself. But how? I thought back to the places he had shown up before. The cafe, the office, my mom's house. He seemed to know where I was at all times. Maybe I could use that to my advantage. I started visiting those same places again, making my presence known, hoping it would draw him out. Days passed without any sign of him. I began to think maybe he was done with me, that I had finally outlasted his game. But just when I started to let my guard down, it happened. I was sitting at the cafe, sipping my coffee, when I saw him. He was across the street, watching me, just like before. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was my chance. I stepped outside and crossed the street, determined not to let him slip away again. He didn't move, just stood there, waiting for me. As I approached, he smiled. An empty, soulless smile that made my skin crawl. "You've been looking for me," he said quietly. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "This ends now," I replied. He tilted his head slightly, as if amused by my words. "You think you can end this?" he asked. I didn't respond. I wasn't here to talk. I lunged at him, grabbing his jacket, pulling him close. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. His expression didn't change. "Because I can," he said softly. His calmness enraged me. I wanted to scream, to hit him, but I held back. I needed answers. "Tell me how to stop this," I demanded, my hands trembling as I tightened my grip on his jacket. He smiled again, that same unnerving smile. "You can't stop this," he said. "There's no ending to this game. Not for you." I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me, but I refused to let him see it. "There has to be a way," I muttered. He leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll break eventually." His words cut deep, but I wouldn't let them take root. I shoved him away, feeling my anger rising. "No," I said firmly. "I won't break." He stood there, watching me, like a predator, sizing up its prey. "We'll see," he said, his voice calm and steady. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I spent the next few days replaying the confrontation in my head. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't even tried to hurt me. It was all psychological. He wanted me to unravel, to doubt myself, to question my sanity. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I started focusing on rebuilding my life. I reconnected with my friends, started going out more, tried to reclaim the parts of myself that he had stolen. For a while, things felt normal again. I was sleeping better, eating regularly, even laughing with friends. The tension that had weighed on me for so long was starting to lift. But in the back of my mind, I knew it was only a matter of time before he came back. He wouldn't give up that easily. He had made it clear that this was a game to him, and he was going to keep playing until one of us broke. I began preparing for his return, even though I didn't know when or where it would happen. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything that had happened, every encounter, every thought. It helped me stay grounded, helped me keep track of what was real and what wasn't. I also started training, physically and mentally, readying myself for the moment when he would come back. I wasn't going to let him catch me off guard again. Then, one evening, as I was walking home from work, I saw him again. This time, he wasn't watching from a distance. He was standing in front of my apartment building, waiting for me. My heart pounded, but I kept my composure. I had been preparing for this. I approached him slowly, my mind racing with everything I had planned. "Back again?" I asked, my voice steady. He smiled, that same chilling smile. "You knew I would be." This time, I didn't let fear take over. I stood my ground, staring him down. "What do you want?" I asked. He shrugged, as if the question bored him. "I want you to understand," he said. "Understand what?" I snapped. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "I want you to understand that this isn't about winning or losing," he said. "It's about seeing how far you're willing to go." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I held my ground. "I'm not playing your game anymore," I said, my voice steady. He chuckled softly. "You think you've already stopped playing? You're still here, aren't you?" He was right, and that realization made my stomach turn. No matter how much I tried to fight it, I was still caught up in his twisted game. But that didn't mean I had to lose. "I'm done," I said firmly. "You won't get in my head anymore." He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled, as if amused by my determination. "We'll see," he said quietly, before turning and walking away once more. This time, I didn't chase after him. I stood there, watching as he disappeared into the night. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control. He would come back, I knew that. But now I understood his game, and I wasn't going to let him break me. I walked into my apartment, locking the door behind me. The fight wasn't over, but I wasn't scared anymore. I spent the next few days in relative peace. He didn't show up, didn't send any messages, or leave any notes. It was almost like he had given up, but I knew better. He was just waiting for the right moment. I stayed alert, ready for him to make his next move. But instead of living in fear, I started focusing on my life again. For the first time in a long while, I was able to breathe. Weeks passed, and there was still no sign of him. I almost started to believe that maybe it really was over, that I had somehow won by refusing to play along. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before he returned. His game wasn't about speed. It was about patience, about pushing me until I cracked. But this time, I was ready. I had rebuilt my life, my mind, and I wasn't going to break. One night, as I was walking home from work, I saw him again. He was standing on the corner of the street, watching me from a distance. But this time, I didn't feel fear. I met his gaze, and instead of running or confronting him, I just kept walking. I didn't let him get under my skin. I knew that's what he wanted, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. I walked past him without a word. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't look back. This was my life, and he wasn't going to take it from me. The tension I had felt for so long started to melt away. For the first time, I realized that the power had always been in my hands. He could try to terrorize me, could try to break me, but in the end, I was the one in control of my mind. The next few weeks were uneventful. He didn't show up again, didn't leave any traces of himself behind. It was as if he had vanished, but I didn't fool myself into thinking it was over. He was still out there, still waiting for his next chance. But now, I was prepared. I had changed. The fear he had used to control me was gone. I wasn't playing his game anymore, and that meant I had already won. Months passed, and life returned to normal. I focused on my work, spent time with friends, and rebuilt my connections with my family. I felt stronger, more resilient than I had ever been before. Every now and then, I would think about him, wonder where he was, what he was doing. But those thoughts didn't control me anymore. I had taken back my life, and it felt good. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. One day, while I was out running errands, I passed by the cafe where it all began. For a moment, I considered going inside, but then I stopped. I realized I didn't need to revisit that place, didn't need to look for him anymore. He no longer had a hold on me. I smiled to myself and kept walking. I was free from the grip he had over my life, and I wasn't going to let him back in. That evening, I sat in my apartment, thinking about everything that had happened. It had been a long, terrifying journey, but I had survived. I had come out stronger on the other side. I knew he could return at any time, could try to worm his way back into my life, but it didn't matter anymore. He couldn't control me. I had taken back my mind, my life, and nothing he did could change that. As I sat there, I heard a noise outside my door. For a moment, my heart skipped a beat, but then I smiled. I wasn't afraid. Whether it was him or just a random noise, it didn't matter. I had taken control, and that was all that mattered. I stood up, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I turned away, ready to move forward with my life, unafraid of what came next. The fear was gone. The power he had over me, the grip he had on my thoughts, had vanished. I had won. It wasn't a flashy victory, not the kind you see in movies, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had tried to break me, but I had rebuilt myself stronger. I knew he could return one day, but I was ready for him. I wouldn't let him control me ever again. This was my life, and I was in charge. In the end, it wasn't about him. It was about me. About how far I could push myself, how much I could endure. And now, I knew that no matter what he did, I would survive. I would thrive. The next time he showed up, and I knew there would be a next time, I would be ready. Because this time, I wasn't scared. I wasn't afraid of the man who looked like me. He was just a shadow, and I had finally stepped into the light. Next story. I'm not the kind of person who gets scared quickly. After years of hiking, nothing ever truly shook me. I've been through every terrain imaginable, but what happened in the mountains last fall still keeps me awake at night. It was a routine trip, or so we thought. A group of 6 of us, experienced hikers, decided to tackle a remote mountain range. The weather was perfect. The plan was simple. Hike up, camp for 2 nights, then descend. It was a trail we'd researched for months, but the deeper we went, the more unsettling things became. The first sign that something was off. We crossed paths with no one, not a single other hiker. For a well-known trail, that was odd. Usually, this time of year drew adventurers from all over. By the second day, we started noticing the strange signs. Then, the leader of our group found what looked like scratches on a tree. They weren't from animals though. It looked deliberate, like someone was leaving a mark, but the direction they were pointing didn't lead to the trail. Ignore it, I said. We all did. It felt like nothing at the time. That night, around the campfire, we were quiet. It wasn't like us. Usually, we'd laugh, joke, talk about the day, but something in the air just felt heavy. It wasn't just the isolation. It was something deeper, a creeping feeling none of us could shake. Sarah was the first to voice it. "Doesn't it feel off?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. We shrugged it off, blaming it on the high altitude. It was easier to pretend nothing was wrong. But when I went to sleep that night, I dreamt of the scratches on the tree. I saw them everywhere, surrounding us. Each tree marked, each one pointing in strange directions. I woke up drenched in sweat. But it was just a dream, right? The next morning, things got worse. Ben's map, our lifeline, was missing. We searched the camp for an hour, but it was gone. Maybe we packed it up by accident, he suggested, trying to stay calm, but I could see it in his eyes, panic. Without the map, we had no way of knowing the best way back. We decided to press on, assuming we could find the trail easily. As we hiked, something strange kept happening. Small things went missing from our packs. A flashlight, matches, a small utility knife. Little by little, our gear was vanishing. "This isn't funny," Ben snapped at us when his compass disappeared. No one admitted to taking anything, and honestly, none of us were in the mood to joke. Something was wrong. We were deep in the mountains by then, surrounded by towering peaks and thick forests. The weather, which had been clear, now felt oppressive. It was like the air was thicker, harder to breathe. Sarah was the first to speak up again. "Do you think someone's out here?" she asked. We all turned to look at her. I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't joking. The truth was, none of us knew. Ben tried to reassure us, saying we were just getting paranoid, but I knew better. This wasn't just paranoia. We were being watched. The thought settled in the pit of my stomach like a rock. From that point on, every rustle in the trees, every shadow in the distance made my heart race. I told myself it was just the wind. By mid-afternoon, we reached a clearing, the perfect place to set up camp for the night, or so we thought. But something was wrong. The clearing wasn't on the map. It was as if the landscape had shifted. There, in the center of the clearing, was a small cairn, a pile of rocks stacked deliberately, unnaturally. It wasn't there by accident. Someone had built it. We approached the cairn cautiously. No one wanted to touch it, but Ben finally kicked one of the rocks loose. Underneath, there was a piece of torn fabric, stained dark red. "It's probably just a prank," he said, though his voice trembled. We all stood there, staring at the pile. No one dared speak after that. The silence felt like a physical presence. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every sound was amplified. The wind, the creaking branches, the occasional rustling of leaves. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, heart pounding. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I woke up, something was outside. I could hear soft footsteps circling our camp, too heavy to be an animal. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, like someone was pacing. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I lay there, frozen in place, for what felt like hours. Finally, I gathered the courage to unzip my tent, just enough to peek out. There was no one there. No sign of anything. Just the eerily still forest. The next morning, the tension in the group was palpable. No one mentioned the footsteps, but I could see the dark circles under everyone's eyes. No one had slept well. We packed up in silence and continued hiking. The trail was harder to follow now, almost like it had disappeared overnight. I tried to keep my focus, but the gnawing feeling of being followed never left me. By the afternoon, we were hopelessly lost. Ben's attempts to navigate without the map were failing. The sun was dipping lower, and we still had no idea where we were. We came across another cairn, this one larger than the last, and beside it, the unmistakable sight of a boot. "One of ours," Sarah gasped. "That's mine," she whispered, her voice shaking. How had it gotten there? We all stared at the boot in disbelief. Sarah hadn't lost anything. She was sure of it. Yet there it was, dirty and worn, just like the one on her foot. I felt my chest tighten. Someone had been watching us. Someone had taken her boot and placed it here as a warning. Ben snapped. "We need to keep moving." None of us argued. We couldn't afford to stand still. By the time the sun began to set, we found ourselves in another clearing. This one wasn't like the last. There were no cairns, no ominous objects, just an eerie quiet. We set up camp, exhausted and scared. No one talked much that night. I sat on the edge of the clearing, looking out into the trees. It was too quiet. No animals, no wind, just silence. As I sat there, I heard something in the distance, a faint humming. It was low, almost like an engine, but not quite. I called out to the others, but no one heard me. The humming grew louder, filling the air around me. It was coming from the forest. My heart raced. I stood up, scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anything. Then, just as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. The night dragged on, and I forced myself to stay awake. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I fell asleep, something terrible would happen. Around midnight, I saw it. A light. It flickered in the distance, deep in the woods. It wasn't a campfire, and it wasn't a flashlight. It moved too quickly, darting between the trees like it was looking for something, or someone. I woke Ben, shaking him urgently. "There's someone out there," I whispered, pointing to the light. He groggily sat up, but by the time he looked, it was gone. "You're imagining things," he muttered, rolling over. But I wasn't. I knew what I saw. Someone or something was out there, watching us, waiting. I didn't sleep a minute after that. Neither did Sarah. The next morning, we made a unanimous decision to get off the mountain, no matter what. We couldn't stay there any longer. The missing items, the cairns, the light, everything was adding up to something we didn't want to face. We didn't talk much as we packed up. We just focused on one goal, getting out. But deep down, I knew the mountain wasn't going to let us go that easily. We started hiking, but the trail was unrecognizable. Where there had been markers and clear paths, there was now nothing but dense trees. The sky, once blue, had turned a dull gray, and the air felt thick. It wasn't long before we realized we were walking in circles. We passed the same tree with the strange scratches twice. Panic set in. We were trapped. Ben tried to stay calm, but I could see him losing it. He was the leader, the one we all looked to for guidance, but now he had no answers. Sarah was crying softly, and the rest of us were too tired and scared to speak. The forest felt alive, like it was toying with us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, following us. But there was nothing. Hours passed, and we were no closer to finding our way out. We decided to set up camp again, even though none of us wanted to stop. As we built the fire, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing. Another cairn, but this one was different. It had something on top, a scrap of fabric, tied into a small knot. It was from Ben's jacket. None of us had touched it. Ben walked over to the cairn, his face pale. "This wasn't here before," he said, voice shaking. He grabbed the fabric, stuffing it into his pocket, but the damage was done. We all knew someone had been in our camp, watching us. None of us slept that night. The fear was too strong, the feeling of being hunted too real. I lay there, eyes wide open, waiting for the inevitable. Morning came, but it brought no relief. We were all on edge, every noise setting off alarms in our heads. We packed up quickly, determined to keep moving, but it was clear we were losing our grip. No one talked anymore. The forest was silent again, too silent. It was suffocating. My head was pounding from lack of sleep, and I knew the others were struggling too. By midday, the tension reached its breaking point. Sarah snapped. "We're not alone out here," she screamed, spinning around as if looking for something in the trees. "They're watching us." Ben tried to calm her down, but I could see it in his eyes that he was just as scared. The rest of us stood there, frozen. What could we say? We all felt it too. We were being hunted. We kept walking, but it was no use. The mountain wasn't letting us go. We passed the same clearing, the same cairn, for the third time that day. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was a mess of fear and exhaustion. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. A distant, eerie whistle. It was faint, but unmistakable. It cut through the air, chilling us to the bone. We stopped dead in our tracks. The whistle echoed through the trees again, closer this time. "We need to move," Ben whispered, eyes wide with fear. But none of us could. We were frozen, staring into the woods, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. The whistle came again, louder, more insistent. My heart was racing, every instinct telling me to run. Finally, Ben snapped us out of it. "Run," he shouted, and we bolted, racing through the trees. The sound of the whistle followed us, growing louder and more frantic. I didn't look back, too scared of what I might see. All I could do was run, my lungs burning and my legs screaming for rest. But there was no stopping now. We had to get out. We had to escape. We ran for what felt like hours. My legs ached, and my lungs felt like they would burst. But the whistle never stopped. It kept coming, always a little too close. The others were just as exhausted, their faces pale with fear and fatigue. Ben kept pushing us forward, muttering under his breath, "Just keep moving." We didn't dare stop. None of us could face what was behind us. Eventually, we stumbled into another clearing, but this one was different. It wasn't wide and open, like the others. This one was small, cramped, and surrounded by trees so thick you could barely see past them. "We can rest here," Ben panted. He collapsed onto the ground, clutching his knees, trying to catch his breath. None of us argued. We were too exhausted to care. As we sat there, gasping for air, the silence returned. The whistle had stopped. It was gone, as if whoever, or whatever had been following us, had decided to let us go. But I didn't trust it. None of us did. The fear was still there, thick in the air. I glanced at Sarah, her eyes wide and wild, still darting around like she expected something to come out of the trees. "Do you think it's over?" I whispered to Ben, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head. "No. This place, it's playing with us." His words sent a shiver down my spine. He was right. The mountain was toying with us, watching us, waiting for us to slip up. I looked around at the others. We were all barely holding it together. And the worst part, we were still lost. After resting for a few minutes, we forced ourselves to get up and keep moving. We couldn't stay in one place too long. The mountain had already made that clear. As we walked, the trees seemed to close in on us, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. It felt like we were walking deeper into something dark, something dangerous. The trail, if you could call it that, was non-existent. Now, we were just wandering, hoping we'd find some sign of the way out. But the deeper we went, the more hopeless it felt. Every rock, every tree, every cairn we passed looked the same. It was like the mountain was repeating itself, trapping us in a never-ending loop. And no matter how far we walked, we never got anywhere. Hours passed, and the daylight began to fade. We hadn't found the trail, or any sign of civilization. Our water was running low, and no one had the energy to talk anymore. We were just stumbling forward, hoping against hope that we'd find a way out. But as the light faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched again. I kept looking over my shoulder, but saw nothing. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were back in another clearing. This one was different though. It wasn't natural. The trees had been cleared in a perfect circle, and in the center was another cairn. This one massive, nearly as tall as I was. It loomed over us like a gravestone. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, staring at it with wide eyes. "We've been here before." She was right. It was the same clearing, the same cairn from earlier in the day. We had come full circle, despite walking in what we thought was a straight line. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't getting out. The mountain wasn't letting us leave. Ben cursed under his breath, kicking at the ground in frustration. "We're not lost," he said bitterly. "We're trapped." Night fell quickly, and with it came the cold. We had no choice but to set up camp again. There was no point in wandering in the dark. We built a small fire, but it did little to chase away the chill in the air or the fear in our hearts. I sat with my back to the fire, staring out into the trees, half expecting to see that flickering light again, but all I saw was darkness. No one spoke much that night. We just sat there, huddled around the fire, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional crackle of the flames. I could feel the tension between us growing. We were all scared, and when fear takes over, it makes people do strange things. I knew it was only a matter of time before something snapped. Around midnight, I heard it again. The whistle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at Ben, but he was already on his feet, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his face pale. The others stirred, their eyes wide with fear. The whistle came again, closer this time. Ben motioned for us to be quiet, listening intently. The whistle sounded again, moving through the trees like it was circling us. I gripped my flashlight tightly, my hands trembling. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The sound was getting closer, louder. Then, out of the darkness, I saw something. Just a glimpse, a shadow moving between the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was there, just beyond the light of the fire. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow moved closer, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure. But before I could get a good look, it was gone, swallowed up by the trees. The whistle stopped. The forest was silent again, but the fear remained, gnawing at my insides. We didn't sleep after that. None of us dared close our eyes. We sat there, huddled together, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself again. But the night passed in agonizing silence, and by morning, we were more exhausted than ever. Ben was the first to speak. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice hoarse. But none of us argued. We couldn't stay here any longer. As we packed up camp, I noticed something strange. One of the rocks from the cairn had been moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew it hadn't been like that the night before. I didn't say anything, but the feeling of dread settled deeper in my chest. Someone had been here, watching us while we slept, or at least while we tried to. We started walking again, heading in what we thought was the direction of the nearest road. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. The mountain wasn't letting us go. Every step felt like a step in the wrong direction, like we were walking deeper into a trap. The trees seemed to close in on us, the air growing heavier with each passing hour. My body ached, and my mind was a blur. By midday, we reached another clearing. This one was smaller, more cramped, but in the center was another cairn. It was the same one, the same pile of rocks we had seen the day before. Sarah broke down, collapsing onto the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. "We're never getting out of here," she cried. None of us knew what to say. We were all thinking the same thing. Ben tried to comfort her, but his words felt hollow. He didn't believe them any more than we did. The mountain had us. It was toying with us, leading us in circles, keeping us just lost enough to hold on to hope, but close enough to the edge of despair that we were starting to crack. And I knew, deep down, that if we didn't find a way out soon, we wouldn't make it. We pressed on, though our pace had slowed. We were all running on fumes, our bodies weak from exhaustion, our minds frayed by fear. The forest felt alive now, like it was watching us, laughing at us. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. The whistle hadn't come again, but the silence was worse. It was suffocating, oppressive. As the sun began to set, I noticed something up ahead. A flash of color. I ran towards it, my heart racing. It was a trail marker, faded and worn, but unmistakable. We had found the trail. "Ben," I shouted, my voice cracking with relief. The others rushed over, and for the first time in days, I saw hope in their eyes. We weren't out yet, but we had a chance. We followed the trail, our pace quickening with each step. The trees began to thin, and I could see glimpses of the sky through the canopy. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in days, I started to believe we might actually make it. But then I heard it. The whistle. Faint, but there. It was coming from behind us, from deep in the forest. It hadn't given up on us yet. We broke into a run, desperate to put as much distance between us and the sound as possible. The trail twisted and turned, but we didn't stop. The whistle grew louder, more insistent. It was closer now, almost right behind us. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs burning with the effort, but I couldn't stop. Not now. We were so close. We couldn't let it catch us. Finally, we broke through the trees and stumbled onto the road. We were out. We had made it. But the whistle, it stopped. Just like that, it was gone. The silence returned, but this time, it was different. It was a relief. We stood there, gasping for breath, looking back at the tree line. There was no sign of the whistle, no sign of whatever had been following us. Ben slumped to the ground, his face pale with exhaustion. "We're out," he muttered, disbelief in his voice. I couldn't believe it either. We had made it out of the mountain. But as I stood there, staring at the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The mountain had let us go, for now, but it was still out there, watching, waiting. Next story. It started on a Saturday morning, when Dad decided to finally tackle the old tree stump in the backyard. The thing had been there since we moved in. It was massive, gnarled, like it had been in the ground for centuries. As he chipped away at the roots, the shovel struck something hard. It wasn't a rock. Dad crouched down, brushing dirt away. A box. It looked old, really old. The box was rusted, about the size of a shoebox, with faded markings on the side. "Should we open it?" I asked, feeling an unsettling tightness in my chest. Mom had come out by then, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Maybe we should call someone," she said, but Dad was already pulling at the lid. It groaned as he pried it open, revealing what looked like old papers. That's when the smell hit us. Stale, like something rotting. Inside the box were brittle, yellowed documents. I reached in, my fingers brushing against something cold and metal, a knife. Its blade was dulled with age, the handle cracked. There was something else, too. It was something that looked like a journal, its pages water-stained and torn. Mom gasped as Dad pulled it out, opening the first page carefully. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. I don't think this is just a diary," Dad muttered, scanning the words. We huddled together, reading over Dad's shoulder. The entries started off ordinary. Talk of gardening, house repairs, small talk. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted. It became darker. Entries filled with paranoia, complaints about strange noises at night, suspicions that someone was watching. One page had the words "I did it" scrawled over and over, filling the entire sheet. My stomach twisted as I looked at the others. Something wasn't right. As we flipped further into the journal, things became clearer and much more disturbing. The entries described a murder. The writer seemed to justify it, rambling about how they had no choice, how they were protecting themselves. The descriptions were vague, but there were enough details to realize that someone had been killed right here, on this property. Dad stood up abruptly, pacing. "We need to call the police," he said, but something told me this was just the beginning. Mom was shaking, clutching her arms to her chest. "How could no one have known about this?" she whispered. Dad didn't answer. He was too busy going through the rest of the box. There were more items, fragments of clothing, torn and stained, and something wrapped in an old cloth. When he unwrapped it, we saw it was a photograph. The picture was of a young woman, smiling, but her eyes seemed hollow. On the back, in the same jagged handwriting, was the word, "Mine." The silence in the air felt thick. I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. Who was she? Was she the one who'd been killed? I wanted to say something, but my throat was dry, and my thoughts raced. Dad dropped the photo like it had burned him. "This is messed up," he said, his voice tight. "We have to call someone." But just as he reached for his phone, there was a knock on the front door. A heavy, deliberate knock. We all froze. No one was supposed to be here. Not now. Dad hesitated, glancing at the box, then the door. "Stay here," he said, stepping toward the house. I wanted to follow him, but Mom grabbed my arm. "Let him go." We waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. When Dad came back, he looked pale. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice wavered. "Just someone from the neighborhood, asking about some old rumors." He wouldn't say more. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Dad took the box inside, locking it in the garage, as if that would somehow make things less real, but the unease lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about that one line, repeated over and over. "I did it. I did it. I did it." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had really happened here. What had the previous owner done? And what else could be hidden beneath our yard? I woke up suddenly, the room dark and silent. For a moment, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, scraping, faint, coming from outside, near where the tree stump had been. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. There it was again. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed, my bare feet cold against the floor. I moved slowly to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. There, by the hole in the ground, was a figure, digging. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. Whoever it was, they hadn't seen me. They were focused on the ground, the sound of metal hitting earth sending chills down my spine. I stepped back, trying to steady my breathing. Should I wake Dad? Call the police? My hand shook as I held my phone, but I couldn't move. The figure paused, looking around, then back to the ground. I watched in horror as they pulled something from the dirt, something wrapped in cloth. The figure lifted the bundle carefully, cradling it in their arms like it was fragile, precious. My heart pounded so loud I was afraid they'd hear it. Slowly, they turned toward the house, and for the first time, I saw their face. It was an older man, his features drawn, eyes hollow. He stared straight at the house for what felt like an eternity, before turning away. I didn't breathe until he disappeared into the shadows. The night was silent again, but I couldn't shake the fear. I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, waiting, watching, but the man didn't return. By morning, I wasn't sure if I had dreamed it or not. When I told Dad, he brushed it off, too focused on the box and its contents. "You probably imagined it," he said, but I knew what I saw. Later that afternoon, while Dad was out, I went back to the backyard, to the hole. There was no sign anyone had been there, but the unease in my chest remained. A few days passed, and the police came by to take a look at the box. They didn't say much, but I could tell from their expressions that they found it disturbing. They took the journal, the knife, and the photograph with them. I hoped that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. That night, the scraping sound returned. This time, it was louder. I sat up in bed, listening. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window again. Something told me not to. The next morning, Dad seemed different. He was quieter, more on edge. He wouldn't talk about the box or the police visit. He spent more time in the garage, where he had stashed the box, even though most of the contents were gone. One evening, I went to check on him. He was sitting in front of the box, staring at the empty space inside. "I should have never opened it," he whispered. The way he said it made my skin crawl. What was he afraid of? The next day, Dad didn't go to work. He stayed home, pacing the house, checking the backyard every few minutes. Mom was worried, but when she asked what was going on, he snapped at her, something he never did. "It's the box," he muttered. "I shouldn't have opened it." The way his eyes darted toward the garage sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't help but think of that man I saw digging. Could Dad know something we didn't? That night I heard Dad leave the house. It was late, well past midnight. I got out of bed, my pulse quickening. From my window, I saw him walking toward the hole in the yard, flashlight in hand. I threw on my jacket and followed him, keeping my distance. He was standing at the edge of the hole, staring down into the dirt. I couldn't see what he was looking at, but the way he stood there, frozen, sent a wave of dread through me. Dad started digging. His movements were frantic, like he was searching for something. The ground was still loose from where the stump had been, so it didn't take long for him to unearth something. He dropped the shovel and knelt down, pulling at the dirt with his hands. I couldn't see clearly, but I knew what it was. Another box. My heart pounded as he opened it. He gasped, stumbling backward. I took a step closer, but I wished I hadn't. Inside the box was more than just papers this time. There were bones, small, brittle bones, wrapped in fabric. My breath caught in my throat. Dad was staring at them, his face pale, his hands shaking. "No," he whispered. "This can't be real." I felt my legs tremble beneath me. What had the previous owner done? Why was this buried here? My mind raced, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was watch as Dad collapsed to the ground. I ran back to the house, my heart slamming against my chest. I found Mom in the kitchen, oblivious to what was happening outside. "We have to call the police," I said, barely able to catch my breath. She looked at me, confused, but when she saw the terror in my eyes, she didn't ask questions. We called, and within minutes, they were at our house again. Dad didn't fight them when they approached the hole. He just sat there, staring at the box, lost in his own world. The police took the second box and questioned Dad for hours. They said they'd found human remains, but they didn't know who they belonged to. The officers seemed as disturbed as we were. I overheard one of them whispering to another about unsolved cases in the area. That night, none of us slept. The house felt colder, like the walls were closing in. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the words scrawled across the pages. How many secrets were buried here? The next few days were a blur of police visits and questioning. Dad stopped talking altogether, retreating into himself. He spent hours sitting in the garage, staring at the empty space where the box had been. Mom tried to help, but he pushed her away. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, one that wouldn't end. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more than just what was in those boxes. Something darker, something we weren't meant to find. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my room. My heart raced as I lay still, listening. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but I could hear the sound of a door creaking open downstairs. I crept down, my legs shaking. Dad was in the garage again, the door hanging open. I watched from the shadows as he knelt in front of the empty box, his hands trembling. "I didn't mean to find it," he whispered to no one. "I shouldn't have." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, I thought he was crying. I wanted to comfort him, but something told me to stay back. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. making it hard to breathe. The next morning, the police came back. This time, they had more questions about the previous owner and what we knew. Dad didn't say much. He just sat there, staring at the floor, answering in short, clipped sentences. After they left, Mom tried to talk to him, but he snapped again. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I shouldn't have touched it. Now it's too late." His words sent a chill down my spine. Too late for what? What had we uncovered? I started digging through old records, trying to find anything about the previous owner. What I found was worse than I had imagined. The man who lived here before us had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His wife had been reported missing years earlier, and there were rumors that she had been murdered, though no one had ever been convicted. My heart raced as I realized that the bones we found in the second box could belong to her. But if they did, where was he? The more I uncovered, the more questions I had. The police wouldn't tell us much, but I overheard one officer talking about reopening the case. "There's something off about this place," he muttered. I couldn't agree more. Every night, the scraping sound returned, and every night, I was too afraid to look outside. But I knew someone was out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The boxers weren't the only things buried here. One night, I decided to confront Dad. He was in the garage, as usual, staring at the empty box. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't look at me. "I can't explain it," he said, his voice hollow. "But something was buried here for a reason. We weren't supposed to find it." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, refusing to answer. I pressed him, but he just whispered, "It's not over." That same night, the scraping sound was louder than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The backyard was dark, the air heavy with tension. I hesitated at the back door, my hand trembling on the handle. Then, I stepped outside. The hole in the yard was empty, but the dirt around it looked freshly disturbed. My breath caught in my throat as I heard the sound again, scraping, this time coming from the far corner of the yard. I shone the flashlight toward the sound, and my blood ran cold. The man from before, the one I'd seen digging, was there again. His back was to me, but I recognized him immediately. He was hunched over, clawing at the dirt with his bare hands. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. Slowly, the man turned his head, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. He stood up, dusting the dirt off his hands. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and cold. I stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The man took a step toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. "This place, it's not yours," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's hers." I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to listen. He took another step, closer now. "You should have never dug it up." His words sent a wave of panic through me, and finally, I bolted back toward the house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it as fast as I could. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I peeked out the window, but the yard was empty. He was gone, just like before. But I knew he would come back. I could feel it. I ran to wake my parents. Dad was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the wall. "He's here," I shouted. "The man from the yard." Dad looked at me, but there was no fear in his eyes, just resignation. "We've stirred something we shouldn't have," Dad said, his voice hollow. "This house, it's tied to something dark." I didn't know what to say. Mom sat beside him, her face pale, her hands clutching each other tightly. "What do we do?" I asked. Dad didn't respond for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "We finish it." I didn't understand what he meant, but the way he said it sent chills down my spine. There was a finality in his voice that terrified me. The next day, Dad spent hours in the garage, going through old papers, researching the house and its history. Mom tried to help, but I could tell she was scared. I was, too. Every night, the scraping sound returned, and every night, I lay awake, waiting for it to stop. But it never did. And each morning, the ground looked more disturbed, as if someone had been digging all night. It was like the earth itself was trying to reveal something we didn't want to see. After days of silence, the police came back. This time, they weren't just asking questions. They were searching the entire property, digging deeper into the ground near the hole. I watched from the window as they unearthed more bones, more fragments of clothing. They didn't say much, but their expressions said it all. This wasn't just an old crime. It was something much worse. I overheard one of the officers say the words "serial killer" under his breath. My stomach turned. The investigation intensified after that. Police were constantly at the house, searching, digging, asking more questions than we had answers for. Dad seemed to grow more distant with each passing day. He barely spoke, spending all his time in the garage, lost in thought. Mom was on edge, trying to hold everything together, but I could tell she was breaking. I wanted to believe that once the police were done, everything would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. One evening, after the police had left for the day, Dad called me into the garage. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow. He held the empty box in his hands. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, his voice shaky. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "I've been dreaming," he continued, "about the man. Every night since we found the box, he says the same thing, over and over. You have to put it back." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say. The man from the yard had been in Dad's dreams, too. "What does he mean, put it back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad shook his head. "I don't know, but I think he means the boxers, the bones, everything we dug up." My heart pounded in my chest. Was that even possible? Could putting everything back stop this nightmare? I didn't want to believe it, but the fear in Dad's eyes told me he was serious. That night, we didn't sleep. Dad gathered everything, the bones, the scraps of fabric, the photographs, and we took it all back to the backyard. The sky was dark, the air thick with tension. We stood around the hole, each of us holding part of the past in our hands. "We're putting it back," Dad said, his voice trembling. I could feel my heart racing as we lowered the remains into the ground. The air felt heavy, like something was watching us. As we buried everything, I half expected the man to appear again, to watch us, just like before. But he didn't. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft thud of dirt covering the past. I didn't know if this would work, if putting everything back would change anything. But as we stood there, in the dark, I felt a strange sense of closure. Maybe, just maybe, we had done what needed to be done. For a few days, things seemed to calm down. The scraping sound stopped. Dad started talking again, though he was still quieter than before. The police wrapped up their investigation, though they never told us much about what they found. I wanted to believe that it was over, that we could move on. But the feeling of unease never truly left. Every time I looked out at the backyard, I felt like something was still watching, still waiting. Then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed when I heard the sound. The faint, familiar scraping of metal against earth. My heart dropped. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the backyard again, from the exact spot where we had buried everything. My stomach twisted in knots. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to. I grabbed my flashlight and crept downstairs, my hands shaking as I opened the door. I stepped outside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hole in the ground was there, just like before, but this time, something was different. The dirt looked like it had been freshly disturbed, like someone had been digging again. My pulse quickened as I walked closer. my flashlight shaking in my hand. And then I saw it. A figure, crouched at the edge of the hole, its back turned to me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure slowly turned, and my blood ran cold. It was the man again. The same one I had seen before. The same hollow eyes, the same expressionless face. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's hers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's always been hers." I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. The man stepped toward me, his eyes locked on mine. "You should have left it alone," he said, his voice filled with quiet anger. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling, but the man didn't follow. He just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. And then, just as before, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the empty hole in the ground. I stood there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to go back inside. The night was silent again, but I knew it wasn't over. It was never going to be over. When I finally went back inside, Dad was waiting for me. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He could see it in my face, in the way my hands were still shaking. "It'll never stop," he said quietly. "We've brought it to the surface, and now it's here to stay." I didn't know what to say. All I could do was nod, my mind numb with fear. There was no escape from this place. The past had claimed us, just like it had claimed everyone before. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. I wanted to believe that the man was gone, that this nightmare was finally behind us. But deep down, I knew better. There were too many secrets buried in this place, too many things we couldn't explain. And even though we had put the boxers back, the past had a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how hard we tried to bury it. The days passed in a strange, tense silence. Dad stopped going to work altogether, staying home to keep an eye on the backyard. The police had stopped coming, their investigation declared inconclusive, but I knew they were just as disturbed as we were. The scraping sounds had stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. I couldn't shake the sense that we had disturbed something far beyond our understanding, something that wouldn't just go away. One evening, after another restless night, I decided to check the backyard one last time. It had been quiet for days, and I hoped that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. I stood at the edge of the hole, the one where we had buried everything, and stared down at the dirt. The ground looked undisturbed, but I couldn't help the uneasy feeling in my chest. As I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye, something sticking out of the ground. It was barely visible, just a small corner of fabric poking through the soil. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down, brushing away the dirt. It was a piece of cloth, old and tattered. I didn't want to touch it, but my hands moved on their own, pulling it free. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same cloth that had been wrapped around the bones. How could it be back? We had buried it deep. I dropped it and stumbled backward, my hands shaking. I ran inside to tell Dad, but when I found him, he was already at the window, staring out at the backyard. "I knew it," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's not going to let us go." I looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He turned to me, his eyes dark and tired. "The house, the land, it's tied to something, something old. We've been trying to bury it, but it keeps coming back." I didn't know what to say. How could any of this be real? But I couldn't deny what I had seen. The fabric, the bones, the man, they were all part of something much bigger, something that had been here long before us. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." Dad just shook his head. "It won't matter," he said. "Wherever we go, it'll follow. We've disturbed something that can't be put back." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped, not by walls or chains, but by something far more terrifying, by the land itself. No matter how far we ran, no matter how hard we tried to forget, the secrets of this place would always find a way to surface. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I sat down, my legs trembling. How could we live like this? How could we ever feel safe again? That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that we had done everything we could to set things right. But deep down, I knew better. The house, the land. It wasn't finished with us. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it, the scraping sound. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from the backyard again, from the same spot where we had buried everything. I didn't want to go outside, didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me, but I knew I had to. I grabbed my flashlight and crept downstairs, my hands shaking as I opened the door. The night air was cold and heavy, the silence thick with tension. I stepped outside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The ground looked disturbed again, like someone had been digging. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer, and then I saw him, the man. He was standing at the edge of the hole, staring down at the freshly unearthed dirt. His back was to me, but I knew he was aware of my presence. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, like he was waiting. My hands trembled as I shone the flashlight on him. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man didn't turn around. Instead, he bent down, reaching into the hole. I couldn't see what he was grabbing, but when he stood up, he was holding something. A small bundle wrapped in cloth, just like before. My heart pounded in my chest. "It's hers," he said quietly, his voice low and filled with a strange sadness. "It's always been hers." I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. The man turned slowly, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You should have left it alone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the darkness, the bundle still clutched in his hands. I stood there, trembling, staring at the empty space where he had been. The hole in the ground was still there, the earth freshly disturbed, but the man was gone. I ran back to the house, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to do, what to think. I went to wake Dad, but when I got to his room, he was already up, standing by the window. "Did you see him?" he asked quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. Dad sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not over," he said. "It's never going to be over." We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Neither of us knew what to say. I wanted to believe it was over, that we had done everything we could to put the past behind us. But deep down, I knew the truth. We had uncovered something we couldn't control, something that wouldn't rest until it had taken its due. The house, the land, they were tied to something dark. And now, so were we. There would be no escape from this place. In the days that followed, we tried to go on with our lives, but nothing felt the same. The house, once warm and familiar, now felt like a prison. The backyard, once a place for family gatherings, had become a graveyard for secrets we weren't meant to uncover. And every night, without fail, I heard the scraping sound. It was always there, just beneath the surface, a constant reminder that some things can never be buried for good. Months passed, and the scraping sound became part of our lives, like the ticking of a clock that never stops. We never spoke about it, never acknowledged it, but we all heard it. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see the man standing there, watching, waiting, but he never appeared again, not in the flesh, at least. Yet I knew he was still out there, somewhere, and so was she, the woman whose bones we had disturbed. Her presence lingered in the silence. Sometimes, Late at night, I would dream of the house as it had been decades ago, before we moved in. In my dreams, I saw the previous owner, a shadowy figure, pacing the halls, his mind unraveling. I saw him digging in the yard, hiding the truth, hoping it would stay buried. But the land never forgets. The earth remembers everything, and now, so did we. The past was not just beneath our feet. It had seeped into our lives, into our bones. We thought about moving, of course, but deep down, we knew it wouldn't matter. The house had claimed us. No matter where we went, the sound would follow, the memories would linger. The past had become a part of us, a weight we could never escape. The man in the yard, the bones in the ground, they would always be with us, just beneath the surface, waiting. And every time I heard the scraping, I knew that it was only a matter of time before the land demanded more. I try to tell myself that we didn't do anything wrong, that we were just unlucky enough to stumble upon something that wasn't meant for us. But sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I wonder if we were chosen. If the house, the land, had been waiting for us all along. Maybe it needed someone to find the boxes, to uncover the secrets. Maybe, in some twisted way, we were part of the story all along. I don't know. But the scraping continues, and the past won't let go. I don't know how long we'll stay here. Part of me wants to leave, to run as far away as possible. But another part of me knows that running won't change anything. The past is always with us, no matter where we go. The land has its grip on us, and we can't shake it. We can't bury it. The boxers, the bones, the man, they're all part of us now. And no matter how hard we try to forget, the scraping will always remind us of what we found. I don't go into the backyard anymore. None of us do. The hole has been filled in, the dirt packed down, but we all know it's still there. The memories, the secrets, they're buried just beneath the surface, waiting. And every night, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, I hear the sound, faint but unmistakable. The past clawing its way back up, reminding me that some things can never stay hidden forever. The land holds on to its secrets, and so do we. We've learned to live with the sound, to accept that the past will always be with us. The scraping has become a part of our lives, a constant reminder of what we found, of what we disturbed. But we survive, we endure, because, in the end, that's all we can do. The past is never truly buried, and neither are we. We live with the knowledge that some things are better left untouched, but it's too late for us now. So here we are, living in the shadow of the past, haunted by what we found and what we uncovered. The house is quiet now, but the land beneath it is alive, always moving, always shifting. And every night, the sound of the past rises from the ground, clawing its way back into our lives. We may never know the full story of what happened here, but one thing is certain. The land remembers, and it never forgets. The scraping sound is our reminder, a soft whisper in the darkness that tells us we are not alone. We may have uncovered the secrets of the past, but it holds us now, just as it held the people before us. The land owns us now. It watches, it waits, and it reminds us with every scrape of metal against earth that some things should have remained buried. And so, we live, tethered to this place, waiting for the day it claims something more. Next story. It started with small things I could explain away at first. A misplaced mug, my jacket on the wrong hook. At the time, I thought it was just stress. I'd just moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood, and I had a lot on my plate. I didn't think much of it. I was still settling in, and things had been busy at work. The tiny oddities blended into the background. Then it got worse. I found my front door slightly ajar when I got home from work one evening. I was sure I'd locked it that morning. I stood there on my porch, my hand gripping the doorknob, my heart pounding. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting someone to be inside. But the house was still, empty. I tried to laugh it off, but it felt different this time. I changed the locks the next day. My friends thought I was being paranoid. "You probably just forgot," they said. "You're under a lot of stress." But I knew I hadn't forgotten. I'm meticulous, always double-checking things. That evening, I sat on my couch, staring at the new lock. I should have felt safer, but a gnawing anxiety crept over me. Someone had been inside my house. More things started to change. I'd come home and find the blinds open when I knew I had closed them. A glass of water on the kitchen counter when I was certain I hadn't poured one. Small things. Things no one would notice unless they lived there. I checked my windows each night, locking them tight, but that uneasy feeling never left. It felt like someone was watching me. One night, I heard something outside, a faint scraping noise, like something dragging across the driveway. I froze in my bed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't dare move, my breath shallow. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. In the morning, there was nothing there. No sign of anyone or anything, but I knew what I'd heard. Someone was close. I installed a camera outside. It was one of those cheap ones I found online, but it gave me some peace of mind. For the first few nights, nothing happened. I watched the footage obsessively, hoping to catch something, anything. Then, on the fourth night, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of my yard, just beyond the reach of the camera's light. They stood still, watching. I called the police, but they didn't seem concerned. "It's probably just a neighbor," the officer said, his voice casual over the phone. "Someone walking their dog late at night." But I knew better. That figure didn't move like someone with a dog. They stood there for nearly an hour, staring at my house. The next night, I stayed up late, peeking through the curtains. A week passed with no sign of the figure, and I started to relax. Maybe the officer had been right after all. Maybe it was just a neighbor. I didn't check the camera for a few days, too tired to obsess over it anymore. But then one night, I woke up to the sound of a creak, the unmistakable groan of my back door hinges. My heart dropped into my stomach. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed, my body trembling. The hallway was pitch black, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the blinds. I dialed 911, but I didn't hit call just yet. I wanted to be sure. I slowly made my way toward the kitchen, each step feeling like it took an eternity. When I reached the back door, it was slightly open. I pushed the door closed and locked it, my hands shaking. I hit call, whispering to the operator as I backed away. The police arrived in minutes, but of course, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No one outside. Just me, standing there, feeling like I was losing my mind. They left, telling me to call if anything else happened. I felt so helpless. For days, I kept to my routine, but I was constantly on edge. Then, one afternoon, I noticed something. I always kept my kitchen drawer organized a certain way. I had a habit of aligning everything perfectly, but when I opened it, the utensils were all slightly off. Not enough for someone else to notice, but I did. Someone had been in my house again. I started locking myself in my bedroom at night, a chair shoved under the doorknob. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't sleep otherwise. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I barely ate, barely slept. I kept replaying the footage in my mind, the figure standing just outside my yard. What did they want? Why hadn't they tried to hurt me yet? Then one morning, I woke up to find a note slipped under my front door. It wasn't threatening, just a single sentence scrawled in messy handwriting. "You look peaceful when you sleep." I nearly vomited. I ran to the police station, shoving the note at the officer on duty. They'd promised to patrol my street more frequently, but it didn't feel like enough. It never did. I spent the next few days at a friend's house. I couldn't bear being alone, but I couldn't stay away forever. I returned home, hoping maybe the extra police presence would scare whoever it was away. For a while, Things seemed normal. No more strange noises. No more signs of someone entering my house. I let myself breathe again. But then, I checked my camera. It was gone. The camera I had installed on my porch had been ripped off, wires dangling where it used to be. Panic surged through me. I ran inside, locking the door behind me. My hands fumbled as I called the police again. When they arrived, they searched the area, but found nothing. No fingerprints. No signs of forced entry. It was like they had never been there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow threatening. I had to know if they were still watching me. So, I sat in the dark, waiting. Hours passed in silence, and I began to think maybe it was over. But then, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on my back door. Not the front door. The back, the one that faced the woods. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my mind racing. What if they came inside? What if this time they didn't just stand outside? I stayed still, barely breathing, waiting for the knock to come again. But it didn't. After what felt like hours, I slowly crept toward the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I finally reached the door, there was nothing. No one. I checked the lock. It was secure. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the glass. A single fingerprint. Smudged, as if someone had pressed their hand against the door, watching me through the glass. I backed away, my mind reeling. They had been there, standing just inches from where I had been. The police came again, but it was always the same. Nothing. No evidence. No clues. I was starting to feel like a ghost in my own home, haunted by someone I couldn't see. I didn't know how much more I could take. I considered leaving, moving somewhere far away, but something held me back. A stubborn need to stay, to not let them win, whoever they were. I decided to install new cameras. Better ones. Hidden ones. This time, I didn't just focus on the front and back of the house. I put them inside, too. Tiny ones, placed in corners and behind furniture. If someone was entering my home, I would catch them. Days passed, and for the first time in months, I started to feel a bit of control. But deep down, I knew it was only temporary. Then, on the third night, I saw him. The footage was grainy, but it was clear. A man, dressed in dark clothing, standing just outside my back door again. This time, he stepped closer, close enough to touch the door. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as he lingered for a few moments, before walking away into the darkness. He had no reason to leave. He just wanted me to know he was there. I took the footage to the police again. This time, they took me seriously. They said they would station a patrol car near my house overnight. But as comforting as that was, I knew it wouldn't stop him. He was careful. He was playing some kind of sick game, and I was his target. I couldn't sleep that night, knowing he was still out there, waiting, watching. A few days passed with no incidents, no strange sounds, no signs of entry. I tried to go back to normal, but normal felt like a distant memory. I found myself obsessively checking the camera footage, but he never appeared again. Not outside, at least. But then, one morning, I noticed something strange on the inside footage. A shift in the shadows. Something almost imperceptible. I rewound the footage, watching closely. That's when I saw it. The pantry door, slightly ajar, moving just a fraction of an inch. But I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been in the kitchen that morning. My blood ran cold. Someone had been inside. They were still coming in, even with the police nearby. I grabbed my keys and left the house, my heart racing. I couldn't stay there anymore. I went to a hotel that night, unable to face the thought of being alone in that house again. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew where I was. That even here, I wasn't safe. I kept the TV on, drowning out the silence, but it didn't help. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing outside, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. The next morning, I went back to the house with a friend. I wasn't going to face this alone. We searched every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. No sign of him. No sign of forced entry. But when we reached the basement, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The small window, barely large enough for a person, was unlocked. It had been closed when I checked it last week. We locked the window and left the house as quickly as possible. I told my friend everything. How long it had been going on, the footage, the feeling of being watched. They stayed with me for a while, but eventually, they had to leave. I was alone again. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and rustle sent a wave of fear through me. I kept checking my phone, waiting for the police to call. The patrol car was still there, parked a few houses down. I knew the officer was watching, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I felt trapped in my own home. The next morning, I decided to take some time off work. I couldn't concentrate anymore. I spent the day watching the footage over and over again, trying to find any sign of him, but there was nothing. It was like he had disappeared. A few days passed, and things seemed to calm down. I almost convinced myself that maybe he had given up. Maybe the police presence had scared him off. But then, one evening, I came home and found something on my doorstep. A small box, plain and unmarked. My heart sank. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I couldn't stop myself. Inside was a photograph, a picture of me, taken from outside my living room window. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. How had he gotten so close without me noticing? He had been there, right outside, watching me. My hands shook as I called the police, my voice barely steady enough to explain what I had found. They arrived quickly, taking the photo as evidence, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. He was still out there, and he wanted me to know that he could get as close as he wanted. That night, I didn't stay in the house. I couldn't. I went to stay with my friend again, but even there, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo, about how close he had been. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him outside, standing in the dark, watching me through the window. I didn't know what to do anymore. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I packed up a few things and drove to my parents' house a few towns over. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I needed to disappear for a while. The drive felt surreal, like I was running away from a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But as soon as I left the house, the weight on my chest eased. For the first time in months, I felt a small sense of relief. Being away from the house gave me space to breathe. I stayed with my parents for a week, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I kept my phone close, half expecting a call from the police, telling me they had found something, but nothing came. It was quiet, too quiet. On the 8th day, I got a call. It was from the detective handling my case. He asked me to come down to the station. My heart raced as I made the drive back to the town I had been trying to escape. When I arrived, the detective sat me down and showed me a series of photos. They had finally caught a glimpse of him on camera. A man in his late 30s, thin, with dark hair. But there was something else. The detective explained that the man they had seen wasn't a stranger. He lived only a few streets away from me. He had been watching me for months, coming into my house whenever he wanted, leaving no trace. He had been careful, methodical, but they still didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. My stomach churned at the thought. He was still out there, and there was nothing I could do. I went back to my parents' house, shaken by what the detective had told me. How could someone so close be watching me all this time without me knowing? It felt like I had been living in a nightmare. I stayed with my parents for a few more days, too afraid to return to my own house. But eventually, I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. I had to face it. I had to go back and reclaim my life. When I finally returned, the house felt different. Empty, but in a way that was unsettling. I checked every room, every corner, expecting to find something out of place. But everything was as I had left it. The cameras were still rolling. The locks were secure. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking in a panic. Maybe it was over. Maybe he had moved on. Weeks passed without any incidents. I started to relax again, slowly falling back into my old routine. But even as things returned to normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I started to relax again, slowly falling back into my old routine. But even as things returned to normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I kept the cameras up, checked them less often, but I always felt like someone was out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. It was a feeling I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. Then, one evening, as I was scrolling through the footage out of habit, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was brief, just a flicker on the camera by the living room window. But it was enough. A figure, standing in the shadows, barely visible. They were back. I paused the footage, zooming in, trying to see more clearly, but the darkness concealed most of their features. It was him. My heart raced as I replayed the footage, over and over. I couldn't believe it. After all this time, he had returned. I called the police immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what I had seen. They promised to send someone over, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. He was playing with me again, showing up just to remind me that I wasn't safe. I wasn't sure I ever would be. The patrol car circled the neighborhood again that night, but there was no sign of him. I watched the footage from inside my house, barely able to breathe as I scanned every second for any movement. But there was nothing. He was gone, just like that. The next morning, the police assured me they would increase their presence in the area. But I knew he wouldn't show himself unless he wanted to. I started staying with friends again, unable to face the thought of being alone in that house. But even when I wasn't there, the fear followed me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that at any moment, he would appear. My friends tried to comfort me, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't understand. How could they? Then one night, I got a call from my neighbor. She sounded shaken. She told me that she had seen someone standing outside my house, just watching. It was late, past midnight, and she had been walking her dog. She didn't get a good look at him, but the description matched what I had seen before. Dark clothing, standing in the shadows. He had been there, right outside, and I hadn't even known. I felt sick. I packed my things and left town that night, driving for hours without a destination. I just needed to get away, to feel some sense of distance between me and the house. Eventually, I found a small motel and checked in, my hands shaking as I handed over my ID. The room was small and dingy, but it didn't matter. I just needed to feel like I was somewhere he couldn't find me. I stayed there for a few days, trying to figure out what to do next. The police couldn't help me. Not really. He hadn't done anything illegal. He just stood there, watched, and waited. I couldn't live like this forever, constantly running and hiding. I called my parents and told them everything. They insisted I come stay with them, and for the first time, I started to consider leaving the house for good. I drove back to my house, determined to pack up and leave for a while. But when I arrived, something was off. The front door was unlocked, even though I had made sure to lock it before I left. My heart raced as I pushed it open, my mind screaming that something was wrong. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. A faint, musty odor, like something had been left to rot. I moved through the house slowly, checking each room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the smell grew stronger as I approached the basement. My hands trembled as I reached for the door. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The air hit me, stale and suffocating. I flipped on the light, and descended the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The basement was empty, but something felt wrong, deeply wrong. I walked to the back of the basement, where the smell was strongest. That's when I saw it. A small, folded piece of paper, tucked behind a shelf. My hands shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. It was another note. "I see you," it read, in the same messy handwriting as before. My breath caught in my throat. He had been inside again, and he had left this for me to find. I ran out of the house and called the police, barely able to speak through the panic. They arrived within minutes, but by then, he was long gone. They searched the house, combing through every inch, but there was no sign of him. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he had never been there, but I knew he had. He had left his mark, and I was terrified of what might come next. The police set up surveillance around my house, and I went to stay with my parents. I couldn't be there anymore, not knowing that he had been inside again, watching me, leaving notes. But even at my parents' house, I didn't feel safe. I knew he was still out there, waiting for the right moment. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him standing in the shadows, watching me, waiting. Weeks passed, and there were no new incidents. No strange notes, no signs of him at my house. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that maybe the increased police presence had finally scared him off, but the fear never left. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching from a distance, waiting for the right time to come back. I couldn't let my guard down, not yet. Then one night I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a notification from my camera app. I hesitated for a moment before checking it, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened the app, I saw him. He was standing at my front door, staring directly into the camera. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He wanted me to see him, to know that he could still get that close. I called the police, my hands trembling as I watched the live feed. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the camera for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away into the night. The police arrived minutes later, but again, he was gone. It was the same pattern, over and over. He showed up just long enough to terrify me, and then vanished without a trace. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left the house for good. I couldn't stay there, not with him constantly coming back. I sold the house and moved across the country, far away from everything that had happened. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that it isn't over. Sometimes, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. I've tried to move on, to rebuild my life in a new place, but the fear never really goes away. I still check the locks obsessively, still double-check the windows before going to bed. I know he's not here. I know I'm far away from that house. But the memories linger, and sometimes, I wonder if he's out there, watching someone else now, waiting for his next victim. The police never caught him. They never even found out who he was. It's as if he vanished the moment I left town. But I can't forget what happened. The way he watched me. The way he came into my home whenever he wanted. I don't think I'll ever truly feel safe again. No matter how far I run. No matter how many locks I change. There's always going to be that part of me that wonders if he's still out there. Watching. Waiting. It's a fear that is burrowed deep inside me. A fear I can't shake. Sometimes, I catch myself scanning the faces of strangers, wondering if one of them could be him, but I'll never know for sure. I've tried to explain it to people, but they don't really understand. They say things like, "It's over now," or "You're safe." But those are just words. They don't erase the months of living in fear, of knowing that someone was in my house, watching me, leaving messages. They don't know what it's like to feel hunted, to feel like prey. And that's what I was. Prey. Trapped in my own home. I've stopped checking the camera footage. I've stopped looking for him, because I know I won't find him. He's gone, but the damage is done. I've moved on with my life. Started over in a new place, but the memories linger. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed, I hear the creak of a floorboard, and I'm right back there again, in that house, waiting for the knock on the door that never comes. I've thought about therapy, about trying to work through the trauma, but I'm not ready. Talking about it makes it feel too real, to present. I want to believe that it's behind me, that I'm safe now. But there's a part of me that knows better, a part of me that still feels his eyes on me, even from across the country. I wonder if I'll ever be able to let that go, if I'll ever truly feel at peace again. It's been almost a year since I moved, and things have been quiet. I've started to relax, little by little. But I'm always vigilant, always on guard. I've taken self-defense classes. I've installed the best security system money can buy. I've done everything I can to protect myself. But at the end of the day, none of that matters if he decides to come back. If he finds me again. The thought keeps me up some nights. What if he's out there, waiting for me to let my guard down? What if he's already found me, and he's just biding his time? I try not to think about it, but it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind. It's hard to live with that kind of fear, but I don't have a choice. This is my life now. Always looking over my shoulder, always wondering. I've tried to stay positive, to focus on the good things in my life, my new job, my new friends. But no matter how hard I try, there's always that shadow hanging over me. It's like a weight I can't shake, a constant reminder that I'll never really be free. I want to believe that one day, I'll wake up and it will all feel like a distant memory. But I don't know if that day will ever come. I don't talk about what happened much anymore. I try to leave it in the past, but sometimes, when I'm alone, the memories come flooding back. The notes, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, it's all still so vivid. I've learned to live with it, in a way. I've learned to accept that I'll never have the answers I want. I'll never know why he did it, or what he wanted. And that's the hardest part. Some days are better than others. Some days, I almost feel normal. But then something will happen. Something small. A door creaks, or a shadow moves, and I'm right back there, in that house, with him watching me. I don't think that fear will ever go away completely, but I've learned to live with it. It's a part of me now, just like the memories. It's a scar I carry, invisible to everyone but me. I've started going for long walks at night. It helps clear my head. I know it's probably not the safest thing to do, but there's something about the quiet that makes me feel like I'm in control again. Like I'm reclaiming a part of myself that I lost during those months of fear. I walk through the empty streets, breathing in the cool air, and for a little while, I feel free. But even on those walks, there's always that part of me that's alert, scanning the shadows, listening for footsteps that aren't mine. I can't help it. It's instinct now. I've learned to live with the fear, but I've also learned to protect myself. I carry pepper spray, and I always have my phone in my hand, ready to call for help if I need it. It's not the life I imagined, but it's the life I have now. In the end, I survived. I got out, and I moved on. But the truth is, I'll never really be free from what happened. It's a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my life. I don't know where he is, or if he's still out there, watching someone else. But I do know this. I won't let him take any more from me. I'm still here. I'm still living. And that's something he can't take away. Next story. I've always hated small, quiet towns. They have this way of making you feel like you're being watched, even when you're alone. Maybe that's why I became a detective. I wanted answers, wanted to know who was watching. So, when I got the call about the family that vanished without a trace, locked inside their own home, I wasn't exactly surprised. Disturbed, sure, but not surprised. The house stood at the end of a gravel road, just past the line of trees that seemed too close together, as if they were hiding something. The family had been gone for 5 days by the time I arrived. Neighbors said they hadn't heard a thing. No screams, no arguments, just silence. The front door was locked, and every window sealed shut from the inside. It was my job to figure out how. I stood on the porch for a moment before entering. There was no sign of a break-in, no damage to the locks. The family had simply vanished. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, musty, but also metallic, like old blood. The living room looked normal, pictures of the family on the wall, a half-drunk coffee cup on the table. Everything frozen. As I walked further into the house, the silence became louder, if that makes any sense. My footsteps were the only sound echoing through the rooms. I checked the kitchen first. Dishes in the sink, the refrigerator still humming. Nothing seemed out of place, but that's what made it worse. People don't just disappear in the middle of a meal. Something was terribly wrong here. I headed upstairs. The air was thick, almost hard to breathe. I reached the kids' room first. It was too neat, as if it had been cleaned recently. Toys stacked in perfect rows on the shelves, beds made with military precision. But the strangest thing, a single crayon mark on the wall, leading from the bed to the closet. It wasn't a drawing, more like a straight line, almost like a direction. I opened the closet. Nothing, just clothes hanging neatly, and a few boxes on the floor. But that feeling of being watched crept in again. I closed the door and turned toward the parents' room. The bed was unmade, a book lying open on the nightstand. Everything about it felt normal, too normal. But then I saw it, a small piece of paper, crumpled and half hidden under the bed. I reached for the paper, my heart racing for no reason I could explain. Unfolding it, I saw 3 words scrawled in frantic handwriting. Do not look, that's it. No explanation, no context, just those words. My skin prickled. I had been on the job long enough to know that when someone writes something like that, it usually means you're already in too deep. I shoved the note in my pocket. I left the parents' room, unsure what to make of the note, and moved to the hallway. That's when I noticed it. The attic door. It was slightly ajar, which didn't make sense. The police report said the attic had been sealed. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and pulled the door fully open. A thin rope ladder dropped down. The air that rushed out was stale and freezing, like something had been trapped. I hesitated before climbing up. Something wasn't right about this whole situation, but I needed to know. The attic was dark, save for a single light bulb hanging from a string. I pulled it, and the room flooded with dim, yellow light. At first glance, it seemed empty. Just old furniture, dusty boxes, the usual attic clutter. But then I saw them, footprints in the dust, fresh ones. The footprints led to the far corner of the attic, stopping abruptly at the wall. I followed them, my heart in my throat. There was nothing there, no door, no window, just a wall. But the footprints, they were small, like a child's. I knelt down, brushing my fingers over the dust. There was a faint groove in the floorboards, almost like something had been dragged. I stood up, unnerved. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't normal. But there was no sign of the family, no clue as to where they had gone. I decided to head back downstairs. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It was coming from below, almost like something or someone was moving around in the walls. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I rushed down the ladder and searched the house again. This time, I wasn't just looking. I was tearing the place apart. I checked every wall, every floorboard. There had to be something I missed. But everything was solid, unbroken. I returned to the hallway and stared at the walls. That's when I realized. The closet, the one in the kids' room, was directly below where the attic footprints ended. I ran to the kids' room and yanked open the closet door. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. The back of the closet had a thin crack running down the middle. I pressed my hand against it, and to my shock, it gave way. A hidden door. My pulse quickened. I pushed the door open, revealing a narrow passageway. The air was damp, and the metallic smell was stronger now. I stepped inside, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The passage was tight, forcing me to crouch as I moved forward. The walls were damp, covered in something slick and cold. My mind was racing. How had no one found this before? And where did it lead? I kept moving, my breath coming in shallow gasps. After a few minutes, the passage opened into a small, hidden room. The room was empty, save for a small table in the center. On the table, a single notebook. My hands shook as I flipped it open. The pages were filled with numbers, dates, times, and names. Dozens of names. Some were crossed out, others circled. At the bottom of the last page, in bold letters, was the name of the family that had disappeared. My blood ran cold. This was no random event. I closed the notebook, my mind racing. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was a plan. Something calculated. But why? And by who? I needed answers. But I also needed to get out of that passage. I hurried back the way I came, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. When I finally emerged into the kids' room, I slammed the hidden door shut and collapsed against the wall, trying to breathe. As I sat there, gasping for air, I heard something. A faint whisper, coming from the hallway. I froze, straining to listen. There it was again, clearer this time. It was coming from the direction of the living room. I stood up, heart pounding, and slowly made my way down the stairs. The house was silent, but that whisper had been real. I wasn't alone here. Someone else was in the house. I reached the living room, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The whisper had stopped, but my nerves were on edge. I walked over to the window, checking the locks, still sealed. I was trapped. Then I noticed something that made my heart drop. The crumpled note I had found upstairs. It was on the coffee table now, perfectly flattened out. Do not look, but look where. Before I could think, the whisper came again, closer this time. It wasn't just in my head. I spun around, flashlight pointed toward the hallway. There was no one there, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I grabbed my phone, dialing backup, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I shoved the phone into my pocket, my hands shaking. There had to be a rational explanation for all of this, but my mind was racing, struggling to find one. I stepped into the hallway, feeling the weight of the house pressing in on me. The whisper was gone again, but that didn't mean anything. I forced myself to focus. There had to be a clue I hadn't found yet. Something I'd missed. I decided to check the basement, the one place I hadn't been yet. The door to the basement was old, with chipped paint and a rusty lock. It hadn't been opened in a while, but it wasn't locked. I turned the handle, and it creaked open. A narrow set of wooden stairs led into the dark below. The air rushing up was colder than I expected, like the basement hadn't been touched in years. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I descended the steps. Each creak of the wood under my weight made my pulse quicken. At the bottom, the basement was larger than I thought it would be, with stone walls and a dirt floor. The cold here was biting, unnatural. I scanned the room. There was nothing at first, just old furniture and a few boxes. Then I saw it. A door in the far corner. It was small, almost hidden behind an old cabinet. The wood was rotting, and the door looked like it had been there for years. I pushed the cabinet aside, dust filling the air, and reached for the handle. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a narrow brick-lined passage. My gut twisted. This wasn't on any of the floor plans. I pointed my flashlight inside and took a deep breath. The passage led further underground, narrower than the last one I had found upstairs. The air was thick, damp, and smelled faintly of earth and rust. I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step I took echoed off the walls, making it feel like someone was behind me. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. I needed to get to the end of this tunnel. After what felt like hours, I reached a door at the end of the passage. It was made of iron, thick and rusted, with a heavy latch. I hesitated, knowing that whatever was on the other side could change everything. But I had to know. I lifted the latch and pulled. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, there was something I hadn't expected, a table with a recorder. I stepped into the room, my heart racing. The recorder was an old tape model, and next to it was a pile of old tapes, each marked with dates. They went back years, decades even. The latest tape was from 2 days before the family had disappeared. I slid it into the machine and hit play. At first, all I heard was static, but then, faintly, a voice. It was the father, speaking quietly. "Something isn't right," the man's voice said, low and strained. "We can't leave. I've tried, but the doors won't open. The windows are sealed. We're trapped." His voice trembled with fear. "The kids, they've been hearing things, whispering, scratching in the walls." There was a pause, then a final, chilling sentence. "Whoever finds this, don't look for us. It's already too late." The tape clicked off. My mind reeled as I stared at the machine, my hands shaking. The father had known something was wrong, but he hadn't been able to escape. And now, I was in the same position. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to appear from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just me, and the echo of the man's last words, still ringing in my ears. I grabbed the rest of the tapes, stuffing them into my bag. I needed to get out of this place, and figure out what had happened. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There was a faint glimmer in the far corner of the room, half hidden behind a stack of crates. I moved closer, shining my flashlight over it. It was a door handle, but there was no door, just a section of the wall with a latch. I knelt down, my fingers tracing the edge of the wall. It was subtle, but there was a hidden door here, just like the one upstairs. I hesitated, then pulled the latch. The section of the wall swung open, revealing another passageway, this one even narrower than the others. My gut told me not to go any further, but I had come too far to turn back now. I stepped into the passage, my flashlight flickering. The walls were damp, slick with condensation. I kept my hand on the wall to steady myself as I moved forward, the air growing colder with every step. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper into the earth. Just as I was starting to feel like I would never reach the end, the passage opened into another small room. This one was different though. It wasn't empty. There were shelves lining the walls, filled with jars. Some were cracked, their contents dried and unrecognizable, but others were sealed, filled with dark, murky liquid. In the center of the room, there was a table with what looked like surgical tools laid out. I backed away, my stomach turning. Whatever had been happening here, it wasn't normal. This was something far more sinister. I turned to leave, but stopped when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from the wall to my right. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to break through. I moved closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The wall was stone, cold and solid. But the scraping continued, coming from somewhere just beyond the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. The sound was getting louder, almost frantic. I took a step back, my pulse racing. One had to get out of there. I turned and ran, sprinting back through the narrow passage. My footsteps echoed, the walls seeming to close in around me. I didn't stop until I burst through the door at the other end, slamming it shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, but the scraping had stopped. I stood there, gasping for breath. trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The hidden room, the jars, the tools. It was all too much. I needed to get out of this house, to report what I had found. But as I started toward the basement stairs, something caught my eye. There, on the floor, was a piece of paper. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up, my hands shaking. It was another note. This one was written in the same frantic handwriting as the first. "You're not alone." My blood ran cold. I looked around, scanning the shadows, but there was no one. Just silence. I shoved the note into my pocket and hurried up the stairs, my flashlight flickering again. As I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut, trying to shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I rushed to the front door, grabbing the handle and pulling. It didn't budge. Panic set in as I pulled harder, but the door was locked, just like the windows. I was trapped. I fumbled with my phone again, desperate for a signal. Nothing. My mind raced. How had the family gotten out? Or had they? I was starting to think they hadn't escaped at all. Maybe they were still here, somewhere in the house. I forced myself to focus. There had to be another way out. I checked the windows again, but they were all sealed shut, just like the reports had said. I was running out of options. My eyes darted to the staircase leading to the second floor. If the front door and windows were sealed, maybe there was something up there that I had missed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and climbed the stairs again, slower this time, listening for any sound. But there was nothing. Just the creak of the floorboards under my feet as I reached the top. I went back into the kids' room, my flashlight flickering faintly in the dim space. The closet door was still open, the hidden passage untouched. I checked the walls again, hoping to find some kind of opening, but everything was solid. My gaze landed on the bed, the crayon line still stark against the wall. Something about it nagged at me. Why would a child draw a line leading into the closet? I knelt down by the bed, pushing it aside to get a closer look. The line wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost like it was pointing at something. I followed it, tracing my fingers over the wood, until I noticed something small. Another crack. My heart raced. I pushed harder, and the floorboard shifted, revealing a tiny compartment. Inside, there was an old key, slightly rusted, but intact. I picked up the key, my mind racing. What was it for? I stood up, glancing around the room. Nothing here looked like it needed a key. Then, it hit me. The attic. I had never checked the lock on the attic door. Maybe this was my way out, or at least the key to unlocking the next part of this mystery. I hurried to the hallway, climbed the chair again, and unlocked the attic with trembling hands. The attic door opened wider this time, the cold air rushing out again, but this time, it felt different. I climbed the ladder, the key still in my hand, and pulled the string for the light. The room was the same as before, but now, the footprints in the dust led to the far side of the room where the brick wall was. I followed them, my pulse quickening. Something about this wall was wrong. The bricks were uneven, not like the rest of the wall. I knocked on them, and the sound was hollow. There was a space behind it. My hands shook as I searched for a way to get through, running my fingers along the edges of the bricks. And then I found it. A loose brick, tucked into the corner. I pulled it free, and then another. Before long, a small opening appeared, just big enough to crawl through. I hesitated, staring into the darkness beyond. The air inside was damp and stale, the smell of rust stronger now. But I had no choice. I had come too far to turn back. I squeezed through the opening, my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The space beyond was cramped, cold, and silent. The walls were rough, uneven stone, and the ground beneath me was damp, almost muddy. As I crawled further, the space opened into another room. It was small, barely more than a closet, but there, in the center, was a chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I crawled toward it, the key still in my hand. I knelt in front of it, hesitating for only a moment before slipping the key into the lock. It clicked open with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the cramped space. I opened the chest slowly, my pulse racing. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a small notebook. I picked up the first photo. It was a picture of the family that had disappeared, but they weren't alone. There was a man standing with them, someone I didn't recognize. My gut twisted as I flipped through more photos. The same man was in every picture, always in the background, watching. I grabbed the notebook, flipping it open. Inside were dates, locations, and notes about different families. Some of the entries were crossed out, while others had details about their lives. My hands trembled as I realized what I was holding. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was a pattern, something calculated and cold. The families had been chosen, watched, and taken. But why? I closed the notebook, shoving it into my bag along with the photos. My mind was racing with questions. Who was the man? Why was he in every photo? And where was he now? I crawled back through the opening, my thoughts spinning as I pushed the bricks back into place. As I stood in the attic, I felt a weight settle on me. This wasn't over. Not yet. Whoever did this was still out there. I hurried down the ladder, my hands still shaking. There was only one place left to check, the backyard. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The yard was overgrown, the grass tall and unkempt, but something about the shed at the back of the yard drew my attention. It was small, with peeling paint, and the door was slightly ajar. I made my way toward it, my pulse quickening again. I pushed the shed door open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Inside, it was dark, but I could make out the shapes of old tools and gardening equipment. But something felt off. The air was thick, and there was a faint smell of gasoline. I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping over the floor. That's when I saw it, a small trap door, hidden beneath a pile of old rags. I knelt down, moving the rags aside, and pried the trap door open. A set of narrow stairs led down into the darkness below. My gut told me this was the last place I needed to check. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The space below was small, cramped, and reeked of gasoline. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room. In the center of the room was a single chair, empty, but stained with something dark. My stomach churned as I moved closer. There were chains bolted to the floor, like someone had been kept here. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. This was where the family had been taken, but they were gone now. The only question was, where and who had taken them? I searched the room, my heart pounding. There had to be something I could use, some clue to what had happened. Then I saw it, a small black notebook on the floor, half hidden under the chair. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I flipped it open. The first page was a list of names, just like the one I had found in the hidden room. But this time, there were dates next to each name. The dates stretched back years, and every name had been crossed out, except for one, the family that had disappeared. The date next to their name was just a week ago. My blood ran cold. They hadn't just vanished. They had been taken, just like the others, and whoever had taken them was still out there, watching. My hands shook as I closed the notebook, shoving it into my bag. I climbed back up the stairs, my mind spinning. I needed to get out of here, to report what I had found. But as I stepped out of the shed, I froze. There, at the edge of the yard, stood a man. He was watching me, his face obscured by the shadows. My heart raced as I slowly backed toward the house, keeping my eyes on him. But before I could reach the door, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I ran into the house, slamming the door behind me, my pulse racing. Who was that man? Was he the one who had taken the family? My mind was a whirlwind of questions, but I had no answers. I paced the room, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't stay here. Whoever that man was, he had been watching me, maybe even since I arrived. The realization hit me hard. I was not alone, and I had been watched the entire time. My hands shook as I grabbed my bag, making sure I had everything. The notebooks, the photos. This was the evidence I needed. But now, I had to get out of this house before it was too late. I ran to the back door, my mind racing, but when I tried to pull it open, it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, the door immovable. Panic set in as I yanked harder, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This couldn't be happening. I rushed back through the house to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I twisted the knob, praying it would open this time, but it was still locked. I stood there, my hand on the knob, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to think clearly. This house had hidden passageways, hidden doors. There had to be another way out. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something I might have missed. Then, it hit me. The basement. I hadn't found any exits there, but what if I missed something? I hurried back toward the basement stairs. The basement felt colder this time, more oppressive. I descended the steps quickly, the smell of gasoline still lingering in the air. I scanned the walls, my flashlight flickering faintly in the dim space. Then, I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just behind an old shelf, there was a faint outline in the stone wall, a door. It had to be. I ran over, pulling the shelf aside. The door was small, barely noticeable, but it was real. I reached for the handle, hoping against hope that it wasn't locked. It wasn't. I pushed it open, and a cold gust of air rushed in, chilling me to the bone. The door led to a narrow passage, carved into the earth. This was it, my way out. I stepped inside, moving quickly through the narrow tunnel, the air growing colder with every step. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls damp and slick with moisture. I kept moving, my mind racing. I had to get out of here, to make it to safety, before whoever was watching caught up with me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam weak and uneven, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I forced myself forward, every step taking me closer to freedom, closer to escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light ahead. My heart leaped in my chest as I hurried toward it, my legs burning with exhaustion. The light grew brighter, and soon I emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air. I gasped, taking in deep breaths of the fresh air, my mind spinning with relief. I had made it out. I was free. But my relief was short. As I stood there, catching my breath, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps. They were faint, but unmistakable. Someone was still following me. I glanced around, searching for a place to hide. The woods were thick, the trees close together. I had no choice. I bolted into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get away, to disappear before they caught up with me. I ran deeper into the forest, branches whipping against my face, the sound of footsteps still behind me. I didn't dare look back. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I couldn't stop. Not now, not when I was so close. The woods were dark, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stop. Suddenly, the footsteps behind me stopped. I slowed, my heart still racing, and glanced over my shoulder. The woods were silent, empty. Whoever had been following me was gone. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion. I was safe, for now, but I knew it wasn't over. Whoever had been watching me was still out there, and they weren't done. I took a moment to gather myself, my mind racing with everything that had happened. I had the evidence, the notebooks, the photos. They were all in my bag. But now, I needed to get to safety. I needed to report this to the authorities, to make sure no one else vanished like the family in that house. I stood up, forcing my tired legs to move. I needed to find the road, to get help. As I made my way through the woods, the trees began to thin, and soon, I spotted a faint light in the distance. It was a street lamp, glowing dimly through the trees. Relief washed over me as I hurried toward it, my heart still racing. I stumbled out onto a small country road, the moonlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. I was out of the woods, but the fear still clung to me. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, my eyes scanning the dark road ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that someone was still out there, hidden in the shadows. But I didn't stop. I started walking, my footsteps echoing on the quiet road. I was free. But as I walked, the question lingered in my mind. How long until they came for me, too?